Mason Parker froze at his cabin doorway, coffee mug slipping from his fingers and shattering on the wooden planks, the morning silence broken by his sharp intake of breath. Where he expected empty forest stood a massive black bear, fur matted with blood, swaying weakly on powerful legs. Elizabeth screamed from the garden path, dropping her basket of fresh eggs that cracked and spread across the dirt. Ranger Thompson, halfway up the drive in his Forest Service truck, slammed on his brakes hard enough to send gravel spraying. The bear's eyes, intelligent, desperate, filled with a mother's determination Mason hadn't seen since his ex-wife held their premature daughter, locked with the once feared predator, now pleading. "Dear God in heaven," whispered Mason, one hand instinctively reaching forward. From the bear's bloody jaws hung a small cub, limp as a rag doll, which she gently laid at Mason's feet. What had brought this wild creature to seek human help? And what would it cost them all? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. At 58, Mason Parker wore his solitude like an old jacket, comfortable but frayed at the edges. His cabin, perched on 20 acres bordering Montana's Gallatin National Forest, had been his refuge for 7 years, since walking away from a distinguished career as a wildlife veterinarian. The weathered wooden structure with its wide porch faced east, greeting each day with the same steadfast resilience as its owner. Mason's mornings followed an unchanging ritual: coffee at dawn, journal entries about wildlife sightings, and long walks cataloging native plants. Local townspeople in nearby Riversend called him "that strange animal man," a title he neither disputed nor embraced. His salt and pepper beard and deep-set eyes that missed little movement in the forest added to his reputation as a modern mountain hermit. What few knew was that Mason once headed veterinary services at the prestigious Western Wildlife Conservation Center, where his research on bear rehabilitation had earned international recognition. Fewer still knew the real reason he'd left: a whistle-blowing attempt against unethical research practices that ended with his professional exile rather than the reforms he'd sought. The foreclosure notice that had arrived yesterday marked the third warning from Riversend Community Bank. Mason's savings had dwindled to almost nothing, his small pension barely covering property taxes. In 3 weeks he would lose everything unless a miracle intervened. Elizabeth Hayes lived half a mile down the winding dirt road, her mailbox the only other one on this remote stretch. At 78, the silver-haired widow moved more slowly than when Mason first arrived, but her mind remained sharp as the Montana winter. Twice weekly, she appeared with home-cooked meals and community gossip, ignoring Mason's gruff protest that he preferred solitude. "Some people need people whether they admit it or not," she'd say, blue eyes twinkling beneath deeply wrinkled lids. Elizabeth had outlived her husband by 17 years, and her Vietnam veteran son by 42. Losses that had somehow expanded rather than diminished her capacity for compassion. Mason's cabin walls held no family photos. His divorce 10 years ago had severed not just his marriage but his relationship with his only daughter, Emma. Their last conversation, 4 years earlier, had ended with her declaration that she couldn't understand his obsession with animals over people. The silence between them stretched like the vast Montana sky, seemingly without end. The irony wasn't lost on Mason that he could mend broken wings and heal wounded paws, but couldn't repair the fractures in his own family. His journals, stacked meticulously on handmade shelves, contained more observations of wildlife behavior than personal reflections. It was easier that way. As that blood-soaked dawn broke over his porch, Mason Parker stood at a crossroads he never anticipated, facing a decision that would unravel everything he thought he knew about animals, humans, and the thin line separating their worlds. Time seemed suspended as Mason stared at the limp cub at his feet. its small body barely moving with shallow breaths. The mother bear swayed slightly, dark eyes never leaving his face. Blood dripped from a ragged wound on her shoulder, creating a crimson pattern on the weathered porch boards. "Easy now," Mason whispered, the veterinarian in him automatically assessing both animals. The mother bear's wound appeared defensive, a deep gash that would need cleaning and possibly stitches. The cub, however, looked far worse. Dehydrated, underweight, with what appeared to be puncture wounds along its hindquarters. Mason's mind raced through his options. Protocol demanded he call Montana Fish and Wildlife immediately. Interfering with bears, especially a mother and cub, violated multiple state and federal regulations. But the desperation in the mother's eyes stirred something primitive in his chest, a recognition between living beings that transcended species. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered, slowly kneeling to examine the cub. The mother bear huffed but didn't move, her eyes tracking his every motion. Mason gently touched the cub's side, feeling the rapid, weak heartbeat beneath matted fur. "She's still alive," he confirmed, more to himself than anyone else. With practiced movements that belied his years away from veterinary work, Mason carefully lifted the cub. It weighed far less than it should, perhaps 15 pounds when it should have been 25 or 30. "I'm going to help her," he said to the mother bear, feeling ridiculous for speaking to a wild animal yet compelled by the intelligence in her gaze. As if understanding, the mother bear backed away 3 steps, then sat heavily on her haunches, eyes never leaving the cub. The gesture was so unbear-like that Mason felt a chill run down his spine. Inside his cabin, Mason cleared his kitchen table, laying down old towels before placing the cub on the makeshift examination area. Years of disuse hadn't erased the methodical habits of his former profession. He washed his hands thoroughly, gathered his limited medical supplies, and began a systematic assessment. The cub was female, approximately 5 months old, based on her size and development. Dehydration had sunken her eyes, and her gums showed pale instead of healthy pink. Most concerning were the wounds along her back and hindquarters. Not random injuries from nature, but precise, almost surgical in appearance. "What happened to you, little one?" Mason murmured, cleaning each wound carefully. Through the window he could see the mother bear still sitting sentinel on his property, her massive form visible from multiple angles as he moved about the cabin. She hadn't retreated to the forest as expected. Mason mixed a sugar salt solution for hydration and used a turkey baster to carefully administer small amounts into the cub's mouth. Some primal instinct seemed to remain intact as she weakly swallowed the life-giving fluid. By mid-morning, Mason had stabilized the cub as best he could with his limited supplies. He covered her with a light blanket to maintain body heat and turned his attention to his next problem: what to do about the mother bear, who showed no signs of leaving. Standing at his window, he watched her methodical movements, patrolling a perimeter around his cabin, occasionally sitting to rest her wounded body, always keeping the cabin in sight. The familiar crunch of tires on gravel announced Elizabeth's ancient blue pickup truck. Mason swore under his breath. Wednesday, baking day. He'd completely forgotten her regular visit. He rushed outside, hoping to intercept her before she encountered the bear. "Elizabeth." "Stay in your truck!" he shouted, waving his arms frantically. Elizabeth Hayes had already emerged carrying a covered dish that smelled of cinnamon and apples. She froze mid-step, her eyes widening at the sight of the massive black bear sitting less than 50 yards from Mason's porch. To Mason's astonishment, instead of retreating to her vehicle, Elizabeth merely stopped, studied the situation, and then continued forward at a more measured pace. "I see you've got company this morning," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The bear turned toward the sound but made no aggressive move. "Elizabeth, please get back in your truck," Mason pleaded, his heart pounding with fear for his elderly neighbor. Elizabeth continued her careful approach, now addressing the bear directly. "You're hurt, aren't you, Mama? Looking for help for your little one?" Her tone was conversational, as if speaking to a neighbor at the grocery store rather than a wounded predator. The bear watched Elizabeth with the same intense focus it had given Mason earlier, but remained seated. "For God's sake, Elizabeth," Mason hissed as she finally reached the porch steps. "Where's the cub?" she asked calmly, handing him the still warm pie. "Inside. She's in bad shape," Mason admitted, guiding Elizabeth inside while keeping himself between her and the bear's line of sight. When Elizabeth saw the small form on the kitchen table, her weathered face softened. "Poor little thing," she murmured, setting down her purse and immediately washing her hands at the sink. "What can I do to help?" Mason blinked at her matter-of-fact response. "You're not surprised I brought a bear cub into my house? Or worried about that 1,000-pound mother outside?" Elizabeth's blue eyes crinkled at the corners. "Mason Parker, I've lived in these mountains for 53 years. That mama out there didn't come to attack you. She brought her baby for help." Some things happen for reasons beyond our understanding. Over the next hour, Elizabeth assisted as Mason continued treating the cub. She held the turkey baster while he prepared a more substantial nutrient solution, her steady hands belying her age. When he mentioned calling fish and wildlife, she fixed him with a stern look. "And what will they do? Tranquilize that mother who's already wounded? Take this cub to some facility where they'll either euthanize her or keep her captive forever?" "It's the law, Elizabeth," Mason argued weakly, though his heart wasn't in it. "Some laws need bending when life hangs in the balance," she replied simply. By afternoon, the cub showed small signs of improvement, more regular breathing and stronger swallowing reflexes. Mason had moved her to a padded box near the wood stove, maintaining a warm environment for her weakened body. "She needs a name," Elizabeth declared, sitting at Mason's kitchen table with a cup of tea. "She's not a pet," Mason reminded her. "She's wild. Everything needs a name, Mason. Names give dignity." Mason peered into the box at the small, black form. A white marking on her chest, roughly star-shaped, caught his attention. "Nova," he said suddenly. "Her name is Nova." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. "Perfect." Outside, the mother bear had settled under a large pine tree with clear sightlines to the cabin. Mason had cautiously placed a bowl of water and some berries at the edge of his property. To his surprise, she had approached the offering after he retreated, drinking deeply before returning to her self-appointed post. As dusk approached, Mason made a difficult decision. He called Sarah Mitchell, a former colleague from his conservation center days who now ran a private veterinary practice in Bozeman. After swearing her to secrecy, he described the situation and the cub's condition. "You've got a black bear cub with surgical-looking wounds and the mother brought her to you?" Sarah's disbelief carried clearly through the phone. "Mason, that's impossible, I know. But I'm looking at her right now and her mother is outside my window." After a long pause, Sarah sighed. "The puncture wounds, are they evenly spaced, about 2 centimeters apart, possibly in a grid pattern?" Mason felt a chill. "Yes. How did you know?" "There have been rumors about a research project at Mont Bio, just north of your location. Nothing confirmed, but—" Her voice dropped. "If I were you, I'd check that mother for a tracking device. And Mason, be careful. If someone's running unauthorized experiments on wildlife, they won't be happy about losing their subjects." After ending the call, Mason stood at his window watching the mother bear in the fading light. What had Sarah implied? Unauthorized experiments. It seemed far-fetched, yet the precision of the cub's wounds nagged at him. So Elizabeth had dozed off in his armchair, her soft snores providing a counterpoint to Nova's labored breathing. Mason decided to let her stay rather than wake her for the drive home. He gently covered her with a blanket before checking on Nova one final time. The cub had improved enough to accept small amounts of a milk replacement formula Sarah had recommended. Mason watched her swallow, a fierce protectiveness swelling in his chest. Whatever had happened to this bear family, he was now involved. As darkness settled over the forest, Mason stepped onto his porch with a first aid kit and powerful flashlight. Common sense screamed against what he was contemplating, but he couldn't ignore Sarah's warning. The mother bear watched his approach, rising to her feet, but making no threatening moves. "I need to check your wound," Mason said softly, advancing with slow, deliberate steps. "I think you're smart enough to understand I'm trying to help." 20 feet away, he stopped, shining his light toward her injured shoulder. The beam illuminated not just the ragged wound he'd seen earlier, but something else. A small, rectangular object partially embedded in her flesh, with a tiny light blinking at regular intervals. Mason's blood ran cold. Sarah was right. Someone had tagged this bear, but with technology far more advanced than the standard tracking collars used by conservation agencies. The mother bear turned to display her wound more clearly, a movement so deliberate it defied natural behavior. Mason felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet as he realized the profound implication of her actions. This wasn't just a desperate mother seeking help. This bear knew exactly what she was doing and who she was bringing her cub to. The morning sun filtered through pine branches as Mason studied the device embedded in the mother bear's shoulder. After a sleepless night researching tracking technologies, he'd returned to the tree where she rested, carrying medical supplies and a growing sense of unease. The device wasn't standard fish and wildlife issue, too small, too sophisticated, with a pulsing blue light he'd never seen on conservation trackers. "This is going to hurt," he warned, approaching with antiseptic and forceps. The bear watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, but remained still as he cleaned the area around the device. With careful precision, Mason extracted the tracker from inflamed flesh, wincing as the bear huffed in pain, but didn't lash out. The small metal rectangle bore no agency markings, just a serial number and a logo he didn't recognize, a stylized mountain peak with the letters MB beneath it. Mason dropped it into a specimen bag, his mind racing. This was Montbio's work, just as Sarah had suggested. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth sat beside Nova's makeshift bed, feeding the cub with surprising skill. "She took 2 full syringes of formula," she reported, her wrinkled face brightening. "And look, she's trying to sit up." The cub had indeed improved overnight, her eyes more alert, movements stronger. Mason felt a surge of hope tempered with growing concern about what he'd discovered. "Elizabeth, I need to show you something." He placed the tracking device on the table. This was in the mother bear's shoulder. It's not standard wildlife monitoring equipment. Elizabeth adjusted her glasses, peering at the device. "Montbio," she said, recognizing the logo. "They built that fancy research center up by Larson Creek about 3 years ago. Very secretive place. My church friend Harriet's grandson works security there, says even he doesn't know what goes on in the restricted areas." Mason opened his laptop, searching for information about Montbio Research Center. The company's website described it as a leader in biomedical innovation and environmental adaptation studies, with vague references to wildlife monitoring programs and pharmaceutical development. Their director is Dr. Victor Reynolds, Mason read, clicking on a biography page. The name struck a chord deep in his memory. "Wait, I know him. He was at Western Wildlife Conservation when I started there. Brilliant researcher, but—" Mason trailed off, remembering uncomfortable conversations about research boundaries. A photo loaded on screen. A distinguished man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Elizabeth leaned closer. "He comes to town council meetings sometimes when they need approval for something," she said. Always talks about how their research will revolutionize medicine. Very convincing speaker. Mason scrolled through news articles mentioning MontBio, finding mostly press releases about grants and vague research breakthroughs, nothing about bear studies or wildlife experiments. He closed the laptop with frustration. Whatever they're doing with these bears, they're keeping it quiet. A vehicle approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Mason spotted the familiar green truck of Ranger Michael Thompson, Montana Fish and Wildlife Service. The mother bear had already retreated deeper into the trees, though still within sight of the cabin. "That's all we need," Mason muttered. He turned to Elizabeth. "Not a word about the tracking device. Let me handle this." Ranger Thompson was a man of few words and considerable authority. At 42, he'd patrolled this region for 15 years, earning respect from locals for his fair-minded approach to wildlife management. His weathered face remained impassive as Mason greeted him on the porch. "Got a report of unusual bear activity in this area," Thompson said without preamble. "Anything you can tell me about that, Dr. Parker?" The use of his professional title wasn't lost on Mason. Thompson knew his background. "Seen a mother and cub passing through," Mason admitted carefully. "They moved on yesterday." Thompson's gaze swept the property. "Strange time of year for a mother to be moving her cub. Spring cubs usually stay close to established territory." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Mason, I respect your experience with wildlife. If there's something going on here I should know about, professional courtesy would be appreciated." Before Mason could respond, a weak cry came from inside the cabin. Thompson's head snapped toward the sound, his expression hardening. "That a bear cub in your house, Mason?" Mason's denial died in his throat as the ranger pushed past him into the cabin. Elizabeth stood protectively beside Nova's box, her chin raised in defiance. "Ma'am," Thompson acknowledged her before focusing on the cub, "you're both aware that possession of wildlife, especially threatened species, is a federal offense?" "She was dying," Mason said simply. "The mother brought her to my doorstep yesterday morning." Thompson's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Bears don't bring cubs to humans for medical assistance, Dr. Parker." "This one did," Elizabeth interjected. "I saw it with my own eyes. That mother is still out there, waiting." Thompson moved to the window, scanning the tree line until he spotted the black shape observing them from the forest edge. "Jesus," he muttered. He turned back to the cub, his ranger training warring with obvious curiosity. "You're saying the mother bear deliberately brought her injured cub to you? That's unnatural, I know," Mason finished. "But it happened, and there's more." Against his better judgment, Mason retrieved the tracking device, explaining where he'd found it. Thompson examined it carefully. "This isn't ours. Fish and Wildlife uses standardized radio collars for bear tracking, not implanted devices." He looked up sharply. "Where'd you say this came from?" "MontBio Research Center, we think," Elizabeth offered. Thompson's expression darkened. "They don't have permits for wildlife experimentation that I'm aware of." He pocketed the device. "I'll need to report this, file it as evidence." "And the cub?" Mason asked. "Protocol says I take her to a rehabilitation facility, then release her back to the wild when she's recovered." Thompson hesitated, studying Nova's unusual wounds. "But something's not right here. If MontBio is conducting unauthorized experiments," he straightened, decision made. "I'll report the tracking device and evidence of potential wildlife violations by MontBio. For now, the cub stays here. Unofficial wildlife rehabilitation under your supervision, Dr. Parker. I'll check back tomorrow." After Thompson left, Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That could have gone much worse. Elizabeth nodded, stroking Nova's head gently. "He's a good man, that ranger. Knows right from official aren't always the same thing." Throughout the afternoon, Mason monitored Nova's progress while researching MontBio's activities on his laptop. The company had expanded rapidly over the past 5 years, acquiring land and building state-of-the-art facilities with funding from government contracts and private investors. Their published research focused on neurological treatments and cognitive enhancement therapies, nothing involving wildlife. Elizabeth left before dusk, promising to return the next day with supplies. I'll bring Harriet too, see if she can get more information from her grandson about what goes on in that place. As twilight descended, Mason stepped onto his porch with fresh water for the mother bear. She emerged from the trees with surprising grace for such a large animal, approaching the offering with caution. The wound on her shoulder looked cleaner since Mason had removed the tracker and applied antibiotic ointment. "What did they do to you?" he asked softly as she drank. To his astonishment, after finishing the water, the bear moved toward a patch of wild herbs growing at the forest edge. With deliberate movements, she selected several stems of a plant Mason recognized as yarrow, known for its antimicrobial properties. She returned, dropping the herbs at the edge of the porch before retreating. Mason stared at the offering, a chill running down his spine. This wasn't normal bear behavior, not by any stretch of imagination. He collected the yarrow with trembling hands, recognizing the implications. The bear wasn't just intelligent, she understood medicine. Inside, he crushed the yarrow into a paste as he'd done countless times during his veterinary career, applying it to Nova's wounds along with conventional antibiotics. The cub responded with more energy than she'd shown previously, licking Mason's hand weakly. That night, Mason dreamed of his early days at the conservation center. In the dream, a younger Dr. Victor Reynolds stood in a laboratory saying, "Imagine the possibilities if we could bridge the communication gap with other species, Mason, the secrets they could share about healing, about survival." Mason jolted awake at 3 a.m., fragments of memory surfacing. Reynolds had indeed spoken those words during a late-night discussion about animal intelligence. At the time, Mason had thought it merely philosophical speculation. Now he wondered if it had been something more. The first hint of research that would eventually lead to whatever had been done to the bears now in his care. Morning brought Elizabeth back, accompanied by Harriet Wilson, a petite woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. After examining Nova and exclaiming over her improvement, Harriet shared what she knew. "My grandson Jason doesn't say much. Those confidentiality agreements they sign are serious business, but he mentioned that 3 months ago, security protocols changed for the wildlife compound, limited personnel access, special clearance required." "Wildlife compound?" Mason questioned. "Their website doesn't mention any animal research facilities." Harriet nodded knowingly. "It's not on any public documents. Jason says it's a separate building set back in the woods. He's never been inside, just patrols the perimeter." "Has he noticed anything unusual recently?" Mason pressed. "He said there was some commotion about a week ago, researchers running around at night, security teams searching the forest. He assumed an animal had escaped, but no one would confirm it." The timing aligned perfectly with the bear's appearance at Mason's cabin. He shared his suspicions about cognitive enhancement research, showing Harriet the mother bear's unusual behavior with the medicinal herbs. Harriet's expression grew troubled. "If they're experimenting on increasing animal intelligence, that's not just unethical, it's dangerous. Playing God never ends well." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines, moving fast. Mason rushed to the window to see 2 black SUVs with the Montbio logo pulling into his driveway, followed by a sleek silver sedan. "They're here," he said grimly, "and I'm guessing that's Dr. Reynolds in the sedan." Elizabeth moved protectively toward Nova's box. "What do we do?" Mason thought quickly. "Harriet, take my phone. If things go badly, call Ranger Thompson. His number's in my contacts." He handed her the device and the specimen bag containing detailed photos he'd taken of Nova's injuries. "And keep this safe." The mother bear had vanished from sight. retreating deeper into the forest as the vehicles arrived. Mason stepped onto his porch as 4 men in Montbio security uniforms approached, flanking an older gentleman Mason immediately recognized as Victor Reynolds. Time had silvered Reynolds' hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but the intense intelligence in his gaze remained unchanged. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, studying Mason with a mixture of recognition and calculation. "Dr. Parker," he said, his voice as precisely modulated as Mason remembered, "it's been, 15 years? I see you've traded research laboratories for," he glanced around the modest property, "a more rustic lifestyle." "What do you want, Victor?" Mason replied, deliberately using the first name to establish their prior connection. "I believe you have something that belongs to Montbio Research Center," Reynolds said smoothly. "A bear cub specifically, part of a wildlife monitoring program that's quite important to our research." "Wildlife monitoring doesn't require surgical implants or leave precision wounds on cubs," Mason countered. "What are you really doing to these animals, Victor?" A flicker of surprise crossed Reynolds's face. "You've always been observant, Mason. It's what made you a promising researcher before you chose ethical objections over scientific progress." He adjusted his glasses with manicured fingers. "Our work is government-sanctioned and could benefit countless human lives. That's all you need to know." "Government-sanctioned?" Mason questioned. "Because Ranger Thompson seemed quite interested in your tracking device. He wasn't aware of any permits for experimental wildlife research in this region." Reynolds' expression hardened. "Park rangers don't have security clearance for all research protocols. Now, I'll ask once more, please return our research subject. My team is authorized to tranquilize and retrieve the mother as well, once we have the cub." "She's not your research subject," Mason said, anger rising. "She's a wild animal you've experimented on without proper oversight, and she's currently recovering from whatever you did to her." "This is becoming tedious," Reynolds sighed, motioning to his security team. "Search the property." "You don't have authority to search my home," Mason protested, blocking the doorway. Reynolds produced an official-looking document. "Actually, we do. This is a federal wildlife recovery order, granting us permission to retrieve escaped research animals." He smiled thinly. "Benefits of government contracts, Mason. They provide certain accommodations." As the security team advanced, Mason felt a moment of helplessness. Then, from inside the cabin, Elizabeth's voice rang out, surprisingly strong. "Young man, I am calling Congressman Williams right now, my late husband's fishing buddy for 40 years. I'd like to explain why armed men are threatening a respected wildlife veterinarian who's caring for an injured animal." Reynolds hesitated, reassessing the situation. The mention of congressional connections clearly gave him pause. "Mrs. Hayes? Elizabeth Hayes, founding member of Montana Conservation Voters and widow of Judge William Hayes." Elizabeth stepped onto the porch, phone in hand, her small frame somehow imposing. "Would you like me to continue this call, or would you prefer to discuss this situation like civilized people?" Mason hid his surprise at Elizabeth's political connections. She'd never mentioned them before, but her confident stance suggested this wasn't a bluff. Reynolds signaled his team to stand down. "Perhaps we've started on the wrong foot. I'm simply concerned about the welfare of animals involved in important research. Dr. Parker doesn't have the facilities to properly care for them." "Seems to me he's doing a fine job," Elizabeth countered. "That cub was near death when she arrived, and now she's improving. As for facilities, Mason ran the rehabilitation program at Western Wildlife for a decade. I'd say he's qualified." "The situation is more complex than it appears," Reynolds insisted, his composure slipping slightly. "These bears have been modified." He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he'd said too much. "Modified how?" Mason pressed, Sensing vulnerability, Reynolds recovered quickly, treated with experimental medications that require monitoring. It's a matter of public safety. The standoff might have continued, but a new arrival changed the dynamic. Ranger Thompson's truck pulled into the driveway, followed by a Montana State Police vehicle. Reynolds' expression tightened as Thompson approached, uniform crisp and manner official. "Dr. Reynolds," Thompson nodded. "I've been looking into that tracking device Dr. Parker found. Interesting technology. Our department has no record of approved experimental tracking methods for bears in this region. As I was explaining to Dr. Parker, our research operates under federal jurisdiction," Reynolds replied smoothly. "That's what I thought you might say," Thompson countered. "So I contacted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this morning. They have no record of approving experimental protocols for bears in Montana this year." He held up a document. "This is a temporary stop order on any wildlife retrieval by Montbio pending investigation of permit violations." Reynolds's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. Our work is vital to medical advancement. These animals are protected under the Endangered Species Act," Thompson finished firmly. "Now, I suggest you leave Dr. Parker's property while this matter is resolved through proper channels." With barely controlled fury, Reynolds signaled his team to retreat. Before leaving, he turned to Mason. "This isn't over. What we've done can't be undone, and sooner or later you'll realize these aren't ordinary bears." His gaze shifted to the forest edge. "Ask yourself why she brought her cub to you specifically, Mason. Of all the cabins in these woods, why yours?" The question lingered in the air as Reynolds departed, leaving Mason with a growing sense that there was much more to this story than he yet understood, and that somehow he was already part of it. Over the next 2 weeks, Nova's recovery progressed with remarkable speed. The puncture wounds began healing, her appetite increased daily, and her playful nature emerged, chewing on Mason's shoelaces and attempting wobbly walks around the cabin. Mason documented everything meticulously in a journal, his scientist's mind cataloging each development while his heart grew increasingly attached to the small creature. The mother bear maintained her vigilant presence, establishing a routine that both fascinated and unsettled Mason. Each morning she appeared at the forest edge, watching the cabin. By midday, she would approach the porch where Mason left food and fresh water. In the evening, she often brought offerings, specific plants that Mason recognized for their medicinal properties, precisely what Nova needed at each stage of healing. "It's like she's self-prescribing treatment," Mason told Elizabeth one afternoon as they watched the mother bear place a bundle of willow bark, a natural source of salicin, similar to aspirin, beside the water bowl. "This isn't random behavior. She's selecting anti-inflammatory plants." Elizabeth nodded, her weathered hands busy knitting a small blanket for Nova's box. "My grandmother was Cherokee. She always said animals know what medicine they need. We just forgot how to see them doing it." Mason's research into Montbio intensified. With Sarah Mitchell's help, he analyzed blood samples from Nova, discovering traces of compounds he couldn't identify, synthetic elements that didn't match any standard wildlife medications. "Whatever they were testing, it's unlike anything I've seen before," Sarah said during her visit to check on Nova's progress. Her blonde hair was streaked with early gray, her hands steady as she examined the cub. "These bears were definitely part of a controlled study. The precision of the injection sites suggests repeated treatments." "But what kind of study?" Mason pressed, showing her the mother bear's behavioral patterns he'd documented. "She's displaying problem-solving abilities and medical knowledge far beyond normal ursine intelligence." Sarah's expression grew troubled. "There have been rumors in veterinary circles about cognitive enhancement research, attempts to increase animal intelligence for various applications. Most of us dismissed it as ethically impossible to get approved." She hesitated. "Mason, if Montbio has actually succeeded in enhancing these bears' cognitive abilities, it would explain the mother's behavior," Mason finished. Why she sought human help, why she seems to understand medicine, and why they're so desperate to get them back, Sarah added grimly. News of the standoff at Mason's cabin spread through River Send with the efficiency of small-town gossip networks. When he ventured into town for supplies, he found himself the center of attention, receiving either supportive nods or suspicious glances, depending on where residents stood on wildlife issues. At the general store, elderly twins Marjorie and Margaret Wilson, local historians and notorious gossips, cornered him by the canned goods. "Heard you're harboring fugitive bears," Marjorie said with a wink. "About time someone stood up to that fancy research place. Too secretive by half." "Did you know," Margaret added, leaning closer, "that land they built on used to be protected habitat? Mayor Johnson rezoned it after a very generous community development grant from Mont Bio." Mason filed this information away, his suspicions about the company growing. Later that week, Elizabeth arranged a gathering at her home, a quilting circle that turned out to be a strategy meeting with 6 other seniors determined to support Mason's cause. "We may be old, but we're not powerless," declared Harriet Wilson, her knitting needles clicking furiously. "Jason says security at Mont Bio has doubled since your confrontation with Reynolds. They're nervous about something." Howard Blackwell, a retired attorney with thick glasses and boundless energy despite his 82 years, offered legal perspective. "They're operating in a gray area. Federal research permits don't override state wildlife protection laws unless specifically exempted. If they've modified these bears without proper authorization, we need proof," Mason insisted. "Reynolds has powerful connections. Without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, it's just our word against theirs." Elizabeth's living room became command central for what the seniors jokingly called Operation Bare Truth. Howard researched legal precedents, Harriet gathered intelligence through her grandson, and the Wilson twins compiled historical records of Mont Bio's land acquisition. Mason contributed his growing file of observations about the bears' unusual behaviors. Nova's improving health brought new challenges. As she grew stronger, her confinement to Mason's cabin became increasingly difficult to maintain. She needed more space, stimulation, and eventually reintegration with her mother. "The bigger problem," Mason explained to Elizabeth, as they watched Nova attempting to climb the woodpile he'd set up for her exercise, "is that if these bears have been enhanced in some way, they can't simply return to the wild. They'll either be recaptured by Mont Bio or face dangers they're not equipped to handle." "Or become dangers themselves," Elizabeth suggested soberly. "If they're smarter than other bears but still have wild instincts," Mason nodded grimly. "Exactly. It's an ethical minefield." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ranger Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally. His official position remained cautious, but he'd been providing Mason with updates on the investigation into Mont Bio's permits. "They filed emergency motions to recover escaped research subjects," Thompson reported, accepting the coffee Elizabeth offered, "claiming national security interests now. But Fish and Wildlife is standing firm on requiring documentation of all experimental protocols before allowing retrieval." "National security?" Mason echoed incredulously. "What possible national security application could involve bears?" Thompson shrugged. "Military research has strange offshoots. Wouldn't be the first time animals were trained for specialized tasks." The thought sent a chill through Mason. He recalled Reynolds' words about bridging the communication gap with animals. What if their research goal wasn't just enhanced intelligence, but controlled behavior? Animals that could be directed for specific purposes. As Nova grew stronger, Mason began taking her outside for brief periods, always under careful supervision and when the mother bear was present. The first reunion between mother and cub had been breathtaking, gentle nuzzling, soft huffs of recognition, and what Mason could only interpret as relief in the mother's dark eyes. Yet she made no attempt to take Nova back to the forest, seeming to understand the cubs still needed care. Instead, she participated in these supervised visits, sometimes demonstrating behaviors for Nova, teaching her which plants were safe to eat, how to search for grubs under logs. "She's parenting right in front of us," Sarah observed during one such session. "But incorporating our presence into her teaching, it's unprecedented." Mason's financial situation grew increasingly precarious. The final foreclosure notice arrived, giving him 30 days to pay the outstanding balance or vacate the property. The timing couldn't have been worse. Nova was still recovering, and moving her would create significant complications. Elizabeth, upon learning of his predicament, marshaled her senior network. "We won't let them take your home, Mason. Not when you're doing God's work with these bears." To Mason's astonishment, the seniors organized a fundraiser at the Riversend Community Church, a Save the Sanctuary dinner that drew over 100 attendees, raising nearly half the amount needed to stop the foreclosure. Local media covered the event, bringing wider attention to Mason's situation and inevitably to the bears. This publicity had unintended consequences. 3 days after the fundraiser, Mason received a call from Emma, his estranged daughter. Her voice, unheard for 4 years, sounded tentative on the phone. "I saw you on the Bozeman News, Dad. Something about bears and a research facility?" Mason's heart pounded as he explained the situation, carefully omitting the more unbelievable aspects of the mother bear's behavior. When he finished, Emma was silent for a long moment. "This sounds exactly like you," she finally said, her tone unreadable. "Still putting animals first." "Emma," Mason began, the old wound reopening. "No, wait," she interrupted. "I didn't call to argue. I work for a wildlife protection legal firm now, in Colorado. The research you're describing, it could violate several federal statutes. If you're willing, I'd like to help." Mason sat heavily in his kitchen chair, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You're a wildlife attorney?" He could hear the faint smile in her voice. "Turns out the apple didn't fall far from the tree after all. I'll catch a flight tomorrow." That night, Mason sat on his porch watching the stars, his mind reeling from the day's developments. The mother bear emerged from the shadows, approaching closer than usual. In the moonlight, her eyes reflected a deep intelligence as she studied him. "My daughter's coming," Mason told her, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking as if she could understand. "She might be able to help protect you and Nova." The bear huffed softly, then did something extraordinary. She rose briefly on her hind legs, pawed at her chest, and then pointed toward the forest, before dropping back to all fours. The gesture was so deliberate, so human-like, that Mason felt the hair rise on his arms. "You want to show me something?" he whispered. The bear turned, took several steps toward the trees, then looked back expectantly. Against every safety protocol he knew, Mason grabbed a flashlight and followed. The bear led him a quarter-mile into the forest to a hollow beneath a fallen log. There, partially covered with leaves, lay a tattered backpack, a Montbio research pack, according to the logo. With trembling hands, Mason retrieved it, unzipping the main compartment to find a waterproof case containing a tablet computer, research notebooks, and vials of clear liquid labeled only with numbers. He quickly repacked everything, nodding his thanks to the bear, who watched with what he could only interpret as satisfaction. Back at the cabin, Mason examined his find. The tablet was password protected, but the notebooks contained handwritten observations of Subject 17 and Juvenile 17A, detailed records of behavioral tests, medication dosages, and cognitive assessments. The researcher's name on the log sheets, Dr. Elaine Morrow. One entry particularly caught his attention. Subject 17 continues to demonstrate extraordinary recall of human interactions from pre-enhancement period. Today, she clearly recognized Dr. Parker from archive footage, displaying marked excitement and positive association responses. This confirms our hypothesis that cognitive enhancement preserves and potentially strengthens existing memory patterns. Mason read the passage multiple times, his pulse racing. Pre-enhancement period, archive footage, recognized Dr. Parker. The implications staggered him. When Sarah arrived the next morning to check Nova's progress, Mason showed her the notebooks. Her face paled as she read the relevant passages. "Mason, if I'm understanding this correctly, you knew this bear before, and she remembered you." "That's impossible," Mason insisted, though doubt crept into his voice. "I'd remember working with a bear this distinctive." Sarah flipped through more pages. "According to these notes, Subject 17 was part of a rehabilitation program 8 years ago. Where were you working then?" "Western Wildlife," Mason replied automatically. "Running the bear rehabilitation program before I left to become head veterinarian." A memory surfaced, a young female black bear, unusually calm around humans, with a distinctive white patch on her chest. He'd released her back into the wild himself after 6 months of rehabilitation. "Nova has a star-shaped white patch," he said slowly, "just like her mother." Sarah's eyes widened. "You rehabilitated the mother bear, and somehow she remembered, enough to bring her cub to you when she needed help." "But that doesn't explain the enhanced intelligence, the medical knowledge," Mason protested. "No," Sarah agreed grimly, "but it explains why Reynolds asked why she brought the cub specifically to you. She sought out someone she trusted from before whatever they did to her." The revelation left Mason reeling. If the mother bear had indeed been one of his rehabilitation cases years ago, it created an even more profound ethical dilemma. His connection to these bears extended beyond the current crisis, back to his previous work, to the foundation of his career. That afternoon, as Mason sat on his porch processing this new information, he spotted a familiar truck approaching, Ranger Thompson's vehicle, moving at unusually high speed. Thompson barely waited for the engine to stop before jumping out, his expression grave. "Montbio's lawyers got their emergency retrieval order approved," he announced without preamble. "Federal marshals and a Montbio retrieval team will be here tomorrow morning at 8. They have authorization to tranquilize both bears and remove them to the research facility." "On what grounds?" Mason demanded, panic rising. "National security research protocols," Thompson replied bitterly. "Classification so high even my superiors can't access the details. Reynolds pulled strings at the highest levels. We can't let them take them," Mason insisted. "Not after what we've discovered." Thompson looked torn. "Legally, my hands are tied. I can't obstruct a federal order." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Officially, I've delivered the notification of tomorrow's action. What you do with that information isn't my concern." After Thompson left, Mason called an emergency meeting. Elizabeth, Sarah, Howard, and the other seniors arrived within the hour, faces determined despite the dire news. "We need to move them," Mason said, laying out the situation. "Tonight, find somewhere safe until Emma arrives with legal options." "My sister has a cabin near Yellowstone," Sarah offered. "It's remote, accessible only by Forest Service roads. We could move them there temporarily." Howard shook his head. "Moving endangered species across county lines without permits compounds the legal issues. We need a solution that doesn't create more problems." "What about hiding them here?" Elizabeth suggested. "This property has that old root cellar from the homesteading days. If we could conceal them just long enough for Emma to file for an emergency injunction." The discussion continued as dusk approached, each option presenting new complications. Through the window, Mason watched the mother bear at her usual post, seemingly unaware of the threat looming over her and her cub. Nova had grown strong enough to walk confidently, though her wounds were still healing. She playfully batted at Mason's hand as he checked her stitches, her trust in him complete and unquestioning. The thought of her back in a laboratory, subjected to experiments and confinement, was unbearable. As night fell, the group settled on a desperate plan. Emma would file emergency motions first thing in the morning, while Mason would attempt to delay the retrieval team. The bears would remain on the property, with Nova hidden in the root cellar and the mother bear free to escape into the forest if necessary. "It's a long shot," Howard admitted, "but sometimes the law needs a little push to catch up with justice." After everyone left, Mason sat alone with Nova, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Tomorrow could bring salvation or heartbreak, not just for the bears, but for his own redemption. The mother bear had trusted him with her most precious possession. He couldn't let her down. Outside in the darkness, thunder rumbled across distant mountains. A storm was coming, in more ways than one. Mason gathered Nova into his arms, her warm weight a reminder of everything at stake. "Whatever happens," he whispered into her fur, "I promise I'll fight for you both." As if understanding, Nova nuzzled his chin with her cool, damp nose. A gesture so gentle, so trusting, that Mason felt his resolve harden into unbreakable determination. Whatever Reynolds had done to these bears, whatever secrets Montbio was hiding, one thing was certain: tomorrow would change everything. The distant headlights of an approaching vehicle caught Mason's attention. Too late for casual visitors, too slow for emergency services. He placed Nova carefully in her box and moved to the window, watching as a sleek rental car navigated the rutted driveway. When the driver stepped out, Mason's breath caught. Emma, a day earlier than expected, her dark hair shorter than he remembered, her stance more confident. She looked up at the cabin, spotted him in the window, and offered a tentative wave. As Mason opened the door to greet his daughter, the mother bear emerged from the shadows, watching this new development with intelligent eyes. For a brief moment, the three species stood in a triangle of uncertain alliance: human, and bear, connected by circumstances none could have predicted, but all somehow understood were momentous. The storm clouds parted briefly, allowing moonlight to illuminate the scene, a moment of silver clarity before the darkness closed in again. Tomorrow would decide all their fates, but tonight at least they were not alone in the struggle. Dawn broke with steel-gray light filtering through storm clouds as Mason poured coffee for Emma at his kitchen table. The night had been a rush of explanations, planning, and cautious reunion, neither father nor daughter quite ready to address the years of silence between them, focusing instead on the immediate crisis. Emma, now 32, had matured into a poised professional, her childhood stubbornness refined into determined advocacy. She examined the Montbio research notebooks with mounting concern, occasionally making notes on her laptop. "This is beyond unethical," she said finally, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "These tests violate at least 6 federal wildlife protection statutes, not to mention basic research ethics protocols." She looked up at Mason. "And you're certain the mother bear was part of your rehabilitation program?" Mason nodded, sliding a worn photo across the table, himself 8 years younger, standing beside a tranquilized black bear with a distinctive white chest patch. "This was the day we released her. She was about 3 years old then, unusually calm around humans. We named her Stella because of that star marking." Emma studied the photo, her expression softening slightly. "I remember you talking about her. It was right before—" She trailed off, the unspoken reference to their family's collapse hanging between them. "Before your mother and I separated," Mason finished quietly. "Yes." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Nova tumbled out of her box in the living room, her playful grunts drawing both their attention. Emma's professional detachment melted as she watched the cub attempt to climb the leg of a chair. "She's beautiful," Emma admitted, "and definitely showing cognitive abilities beyond normal bear development." Outside, the mother bear, Stella as Mason now thought of her, maintained her vigilant position near the porch. The forecasted rain had held off, though dark clouds still threatened overhead. "The federal retrieval team will be here in 2 hours," Mason said, checking his watch. "We need to finalize our plan." Emma closed her laptop decisively. "I've drafted an emergency injunction based on the evidence in these notebooks. It argues that Mont Bio's research constitutes animal cruelty and unauthorized experimentation on protected wildlife. I'll file it electronically the moment the courthouse opens at 8. "Will that stop them?" Mason asked. Emma's expression was grimly realistic. "It should trigger an automatic review before the bears can be removed from the property. But with the national security angle Reynolds is playing," she shrugged, "it's a delaying tactic at best. What we really need is public pressure." "I might have something for that," Mason said, retrieving his phone. He played a video he'd recorded yesterday, Stella carefully selecting medicinal plants and bringing them to the porch, followed by footage of her gentle interactions with Nova during their supervised reunions. The behaviors were undeniably deliberate, showing intelligence far beyond normal ursine capabilities. "This is extraordinary," Emma breathed. "If people saw this—" "Exactly," Mason agreed. "Reynolds wants to keep their research secret. What if we make it impossible to hide?" Their strategy session was interrupted by the arrival of Elizabeth's ancient blue pickup, followed by a caravan of vehicles that nearly filled Mason's small clearing. Howard's Lincoln, Sarah's Subaru, the Wilson twins' matching Buicks, and at least a dozen other cars and trucks bearing Riversend's senior citizens. "Cavalry's here," Elizabeth announced cheerfully as she entered without knocking, a large thermos in one hand and a box of donuts in the other. Behind her streamed nearly 20 elderly supporters, many carrying folding chairs and thermoses of their own. "What's all this?" Mason asked, bewildered by the influx. Howard adjusted his thick glasses, looking surprisingly formidable despite his 82 years. "You didn't think we'd let you face this alone, did you? We're staging a protest. Peaceful, legal, and right where those federal agents will have to go through us to get to those bears." "I called Pastor Williams," Harriet added. "He's bringing the church group, and the Wilson twins contacted the local news stations." Mason looked at the determined faces surrounding him, people who had gone from neighbors to allies to friends in the span of a few weeks. I don't know what to say." "Say you've got a plan for those bears," Elizabeth replied pragmatically. "Because we can buy you time, but we need to know what victory looks like." Emma stepped forward, introducing herself with the confidence of a practiced attorney. She outlined their legal strategy while Mason explained the evidence they'd gathered. The seniors listened attentively, occasionally offering suggestions from their varied life experiences. "We need to make sure the media sees the mother bear's unusual behaviors," suggested Margaret Wilson. "Nothing convinces people like seeing with their own eyes." "And we need to expose Reynolds's real research goals," added Howard. "These notebooks suggest military applications. That's something the public should know about." As they finalized their approach, Mason noticed Ranger Thompson's truck pulling up. The ranger's expression was solemn as he approached the gathering on the porch. "Quite a turnout," he observed, surveying the growing crowd. "I've come to give you an update. The federal team has assembled at the Riversend Sheriff's Office, 6 agents plus Dr. Reynolds and 4 Mont Bio handlers. They've got transport cages and tranquilizer equipment." He lowered his voice. "And I thought you should know, they've obtained a temporary restraining order against anyone interfering with the retrieval." "Including you?" Mason asked. Thompson nodded grimly. I've been officially ordered to assist them in locating and securing the animals. Direct orders from the regional director." A heavy silence fell over the group. Thompson's assistance would make hiding the bears nearly impossible. He knew the property and surrounding forest better than almost anyone. "So what will you do?" Elizabeth asked bluntly. Thompson removed his ranger hat, turning it in his hands. "My father served 40 years in this department, taught me that a ranger's first duty is to the wildlife, not to politics." He looked directly at Mason. "I'll be accompanying the federal team to ensure proper wildlife handling protocols are followed. I'll need to inspect the entire property very thoroughly, which could take considerable time, especially with all these citizens exercising their right to peaceful assembly." The implication was clear. Thompson would slow the process as much as possible without directly disobeying orders. Mason nodded his gratitude. "They'll be here within the hour," Thompson concluded, replacing his hat. "I'd better get back before they wonder why I came ahead." He paused at his truck, adding, "Good luck." As Thompson departed, the assembly on Mason's property continued to grow. Pastor Williams arrived with 2 church vans full of parishioners. Local reporters set up cameras at the edge of the driveway. Elizabeth's senior network organized themselves into a formidable line across the access road, folding chairs and thermoses, establishing their intent to remain for the duration. Through it all, Stella watched from the tree line, her dark eyes taking in the gathering humans with what Mason could only interpret as understanding. Nova remained inside, currently napping in her box, unaware of the forces mobilizing around her. Emma finished her legal filing precisely at 8 o'clock, receiving confirmation that the emergency injunction request had been received by the court. "Now we wait," she told Mason, "and hope the judge reviewing it acts quickly." At 8:17, the first vehicles of the federal retrieval team appeared at the end of Mason's long driveway, black SUVs with government plates, followed by a Mont Bio van with cage equipment visible through the windows. They stopped where Elizabeth's senior blockade covered the narrow access road. Mason, standing on his porch with Emma beside him, watched through binoculars as men in dark uniforms spoke with the elderly protesters. Even from a distance, he could see Elizabeth's chin jutting stubbornly as she apparently explained why 24 senior citizens were enjoying a morning coffee gathering on a public access road. "They can't physically remove all those people," Emma observed, "not without creating a PR nightmare." Mason spotted Reynolds emerging from one of the vehicles, his tailored suit incongruous in the rural setting. The scientist appeared to be arguing with someone on his phone, gesturing emphatically toward the blockade. "He's realizing this won't be the quiet seizure he planned," Mason said with grim satisfaction. The standoff at the road continued for nearly 20 minutes before the federal agents began carefully navigating their vehicles around the protesters, forced to drive partially off-road to reach the cabin. The process was painstakingly slow, with Elizabeth's group repositioning their chairs to maintain maximum inconvenience without technically obstructing federal officers. As the vehicles finally approached the cabin clearing, Mason took a deep breath, squeezing Emma's hand briefly before stepping forward to meet them. Sarah and Howard flanked him, while the local news cameras recorded everything from a respectful distance. 6 federal agents in tactical gear emerged first, followed by Reynolds and his Mont Bio team. Ranger Thompson was the last to exit, his expression professionally neutral. "Dr. Parker," the lead federal agent addressed Mason, "I'm Agent Holloway, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Special Operations Division. We have a federal order to retrieve 2 black bears currently on your property, an adult female and a juvenile, that are the property of Mont Bio Research Center under Special Research Authorization." "I'm aware of your order," Mason replied calmly, "but I've filed an emergency injunction this morning challenging the legality of Mont Bio's research. Until a judge reviews that filing, removing these bears would be premature." The injunction hasn't been granted, Reynolds interjected smoothly, stepping forward. Our authorization supersedes normal wildlife protocols under special research exemptions. He surveyed the gathered crowd with thinly veiled annoyance. This display is unnecessary and potentially dangerous. These animals have been subjected to experimental treatments that make their behavior unpredictable. Experimental treatments you had no proper authorization to conduct, Emma countered, stepping forward with professional authority. I'm Emma Parker, wildlife protection attorney. The documentation we've obtained indicates clear violations of the Endangered Species Act and Animal Welfare Act. Reynolds' expression flickered with surprise at Emma's presence before he regained his composure. Whatever allegations you're making can be addressed through proper channels. Right now, these animals represent both valuable research subjects and potential public safety concerns. Public safety, Howard challenged, his voice carrying clearly despite his age. Then perhaps you should explain to these good people exactly what you've been doing to these bears, Dr. Reynolds. Why don't you tell them about the cognitive enhancement experiments, the potential military applications? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The news cameras moved closer, capturing Reynolds's momentary discomfort. Agent Holloway looked between the parties with growing uncertainty. Dr. Reynolds, is there something about this retrieval I should be aware of? My team was briefed this was a simple recovery of escaped research animals. It is precisely that, Reynolds insisted. These bears are part of a classified research program with appropriate authorizations, Doctor. Parker has no right to interfere, regardless of his personal feelings about animal research. Then you won't mind if I inspect the cub before she's transported, Ranger Thompson interjected, stepping forward. Standard wildlife handling protocol requires assessment of any animal before relocation. Reynolds's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Fine. A brief inspection only. Mason led Thompson, Holloway, and Reynolds into the cabin where Nova had awoken and was playfully batting at a rubber ball. The cub looked up as they entered, immediately scampering to Mason's side and hiding partially behind his legs, a remarkably dog-like behavior that wasn't lost on Agent Holloway. That's not normal bear behavior, he observed quietly. No, it's not, Mason agreed, kneeling to reassure Nova with a gentle hand on her back. And neither is this. He rolled the ball across the floor. Nova watched its path, then deliberately rolled it back to him, a clear demonstration of play and interaction far beyond typical bear capabilities. Thompson knelt to examine Nova more closely, noting the healing wounds with professional interest. These are unusual injuries, he commented. Very precise, almost surgical. Reynolds remained by the door, his discomfort visibly growing as Nova continued to display abnormal intelligence, responding to Mason's simple hand commands, bringing specific objects when pointed to. What exactly was your research goal, Dr. Reynolds? Holloway asked directly, watching the cub's behaviors with increasing concern. Before Reynolds could answer, Emma entered with her laptop. I've just received notice that Judge Friedman has granted our emergency injunction pending review. The bears cannot be removed until a hearing evaluates the evidence. She displayed the court document on her screen. Reynolds' composure finally cracked. This is absurd. We're on the verge of revolutionary breakthroughs in cross-species neural development. These animals are the result of years of careful work. Neural development? Holloway repeated, turning to face Reynolds fully. My orders mention nothing about neurological experimentation on endangered species. The research is classified, Reynolds insisted. Your job is simply to retrieve the subjects. My job, Holloway corrected firmly, is to enforce wildlife protection laws. If these bears have been subjected to unauthorized neural experimentation, that changes the entire situation. He turned to Thompson. Ranger, what's your assessment? Thompson straightened, professionalism evident in every line of his body. Based on my observations, These bears show signs of significant behavioral modification beyond anything I've encountered in 20 years of wildlife management. The cub has healing wounds consistent with repeated medical procedures, and the mother displays problem-solving abilities that are, frankly, impossible for normal bears. The confrontation might have continued, but a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Mason spotted Stella approaching the cabin, walking directly past the gathered crowd, past the federal agents, with deliberate purpose. "My God," Holloway breathed, watching the massive bear's calm, intentional movements. "What have you done to that animal, Reynolds?" Reynolds didn't answer, his face pale as he watched Stella climb the porch steps with almost human determination. The mother bear stopped at the cabin door, rising briefly to her hind legs and pawing at the handle, clearly attempting to enter. Mason moved to open the door, ignoring Reynolds's protest. Stella entered cautiously, immediately focusing on Nova, who bounded toward her mother with evident joy. The reunion was brief but powerful, gentle nuzzling, soft vocalizations unlike typical bear sounds. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Stella turned her attention to Reynolds. The scientist backed against the wall as the bear approached him, stopping just feet away. There was no aggression in her posture, only what Mason could only describe as recognition and accusation. Reynolds stared into the bear's eyes, his scientific detachment crumbling visibly. "Remarkable," he whispered. "She remembers. Even after everything, she still recognizes me." "What exactly did you do to her, Victor?" Mason demanded, the use of Reynolds's first name reminding everyone of their past connection. Reynolds tore his gaze from Stella, looking instead at Mason with a complex mix of emotions. "We were continuing your work, in a way," he said quietly. "Your rehabilitation techniques with bears showed unusual cognitive outcomes, higher success rates for wilderness reintegration, advanced problem-solving abilities. After you left, I wondered if there was something more fundamental happening during the human-bear interaction period." "So you experimented on animals I rehabilitated?" Mason's voice rose with anger. "Without oversight or ethical review?" "Initially, we had full authorization," Reynolds countered. "A legitimate study of bear cognition. But when Stella, subject 17, showed unprecedented responses to our cognitive tests, private military contractors became interested. The funding increased exponentially, and the research evolved." Outside, the news cameras had captured Stella's deliberate approach to the cabin. The footage was already being broadcast live on local stations, shocking viewers with the bear's unbear-like behavior. "You enhanced her intelligence," Mason stated flatly, "and then bred her to see if the changes would pass to her offspring." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Nova, juvenile 17A, was the first cub to show inherited cognitive enhancements. We were monitoring her development when they escaped during a transfer between facilities." His gaze returned to Stella. "We never anticipated that she would seek you out specifically, that she would remember you from before the enhancements." Agent Holloway had heard enough. "Dr. Reynolds, based on your own admissions and the evidence before me, I'm suspending this retrieval operation pending full review by the Department of Interior and an ethics investigation." He turned to his team waiting outside. "Stand down the capture equipment. No animals will be removed today." Reynolds's face hardened. "You don't have the authority to—" "Actually, he does," Emma interjected, professional to the core. "Federal wildlife agents have discretionary power when encountering evidence of previously undisclosed research parameters. Isn't that right, Agent Holloway?" Holloway nodded. "Ma'am, I'm going to need copies of all your evidence for my report." He gestured for Reynolds to exit the cabin. "Dr. Reynolds, we'll need a complete briefing on exactly what was done to these animals." As they stepped outside, The gathered crowd gasped at the sight of Stella following calmly behind them, Nova scampering at her heels. The bear's behavior, so clearly intelligent, so obviously beyond normal, was being captured by multiple cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holloway addressed the crowd with authority, "this situation is now under federal investigation. Dr. Reynolds and Montbio Research Center will be cooperating fully regarding their wildlife research activities." Reynolds surveyed the scene, cameras recording, witnesses watching, his carefully controlled research exposed to public scrutiny and seemed to deflate. The carefully constructed justifications, the years of secret work all unraveling in real time. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he said to Mason, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "These bears represent a breakthrough that could transform our understanding of animal cognition, could open communication channels between species. Yes, there were military applications being explored, but the fundamental science could have changed everything." "At what cost, Victor?" Mason challenged. "Look at her." He gestured to Stella, standing calmly amid the chaos, her intelligent eyes taking in everything. "She's not a research subject anymore. She's something in between wild and something else. Neither one thing nor another. What kind of life can she have now?" Before Reynolds could answer, Elizabeth pushed through the crowd, her small frame somehow commanding immediate attention. She walked directly to Stella, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Elizabeth Hayes," she said clearly, addressing the bear as if speaking to a person. "I've been helping care for your little one. She's doing much better now." To the astonishment of the onlookers, Stella dipped her massive head in what looked remarkably like acknowledgement. The moment was captured by every camera present, an elderly woman and a bear communicating across the species barrier in a way that defied conventional explanation. The footage would go viral within hours, sparking national debate about animal intelligence, research ethics, and the boundaries between humans and wildlife. But in that moment, on Mason's porch, it was simply a profound connection between two mothers who understood loss and protection on the most fundamental level. Reynolds watched the interaction with a scientist's fascination warring with human regret. "I never intended," he began, then stopped, unable to finish. As federal agents secured the Montbio research materials and prepared to escort Reynolds for further questioning, Mason found himself standing between two worlds, the human drama unfolding around him and the quiet presence of Stella and Nova, watching it all with eyes that reflected understanding no bear should possess. "What happens to them now?" Emma asked quietly, coming to stand beside her father. Mason looked at the bears, at Stella, who had trusted him enough to bring her most precious possession for healing, and at Nova, caught between her wild heritage and her enhanced mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, they won't face it alone." The storm clouds that had threatened all morning finally opened, sending a gentle rain across the gathering. Most people hurried for shelter, but Mason remained where he was, with Emma beside him and the bears nearby, all of them poised at a moment of transformation, with the old world washing away and something new, uncertain but filled with possibility, taking shape in the rain. The federal investigation into Montbio Research Center expanded rapidly in the days following the confrontation at Mason's cabin. Agents seized computers and research materials from the facility, while Dr. Reynolds faced lengthy questioning about the scope and authorization of his experiments. The footage of Stella's deliberate, almost human behavior had gone viral, prompting national news coverage and heated debate about animal experimentation. Mason found himself at the center of an unexpected media storm. Reporters camped at the end of his driveway, seeking interviews and footage of the miracle bears. Wildlife experts and ethicists called to consult on the unprecedented situation. Through it all, Mason maintained a protective barrier around his property, allowing only Sarah Mitchell and Ranger Thompson regular access to check on the bear's welfare. "They're talking about congressional hearings," Emma informed him one morning over breakfast, scrolling through news updates on her laptop. She had extended her stay indefinitely, working remotely while helping navigate the legal complexities surrounding Stella and Nova. Montbio's government contracts are under review, and 3 oversight committees want to know how Reynolds got approval for this kind of experimentation. Mason nodded absently, his attention on Nova, who was methodically sorting pine cones by size on the cabin floor, behavior so unbear-like it still startled him even after weeks of observation. "Any word on what they plan to do with them?" Emma's expression grew troubled. "That's the problem. There's no precedent for this situation. Fish and Wildlife doesn't have protocols for cognitively enhanced bears. Some officials want them transferred to a research facility for study." "Absolutely not," Mason said firmly. "They've been through enough experimentation." "Others suggest a specialized sanctuary," Emma continued. "But even that feels wrong. Stella clearly has memories of the wild, instincts for natural living, yet she's not entirely wild anymore." She closed her laptop with a sigh. It's an impossible situation. The impossible situation grew more complicated when Elizabeth was hospitalized 3 days later. Mason received the call from Howard at dawn. Elizabeth had suffered a severe cardiac episode in the night and been rushed to Riversend Community Hospital. "Doctors say it's serious," Howard reported gravely. "Stress of the past weeks, her age. They're doing what they can, but she's asking for you." Mason found himself torn. Leaving the bears alone seemed dangerous, with media and curious onlookers still attempting to access his property. But Elizabeth had become family during this ordeal. Emma solved the dilemma by offering to stay with the bears while Mason drove to the hospital. Riversend Community Hospital was a small facility with only 20 beds, its modest exterior belying the quality of care provided by its dedicated staff. Mason found Elizabeth in the ICU, surrounded by monitoring equipment that made her appear even smaller and more fragile than usual. "There you are," she whispered when he entered, her voice weak but her blue eyes still bright. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your oldest supporter." "Never," Mason assured her, taking her thin hand gently. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm 87 instead of 78, she replied with a ghost of her usual humor. "Doctors say my heart's finally showing its age." She squeezed his fingers with surprising strength. "How are our bears?" Mason smiled at her use of "our," realizing how deeply Elizabeth had become invested in Stella and Nova's welfare. "They're doing well. Nova's wounds are completely healed, and Stella continues to amaze us with her intelligence." Elizabeth nodded, satisfaction evident in her tired features. "Good, that's good." She paused, her expression growing serious. "Mason, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Whatever happens with those bears, whatever the government decides, whatever the scientists want, you make sure they have a chance at some kind of natural life, not caged, not studied like curiosities." Her voice strengthened with conviction. "They deserve their dignity." "I promise," Mason assured her, meaning it completely, though uncertain how he could fulfill such a vow. Elizabeth seemed to read his doubt. "You'll find a way. You understand them better than anyone." Her eyes drifted closed briefly, fatigue evident. "And Mason, make peace with Emma. Life's too short for stubborn silence." Mason stayed until Elizabeth fell asleep, her words echoing in his mind as he drove back to the cabin. Make peace with Emma. After years of estrangement, they had achieved a fragile working relationship through the bear crisis, but the deeper wounds remained unaddressed. When he arrived home, he found Emma on the porch with a strange expression on her face. What's wrong? He asked immediately. The bears? They're fine, she assured him quickly. But something odd happened while you were gone. A man from town delivered this. She handed him an envelope. He said his grandfather worked with Reynolds's father decades ago at the original research station near here. When he heard about the bears on the news, he thought you should have it. Mason opened the envelope to find a yellowed photograph and a brief handwritten note. The photo showed a research cabin from the 1970s with a team of young scientists, and prominently visible a young Victor Reynolds standing beside his father, both examining what appeared to be animal tracking equipment. The note was brief but stunning. Reynolds' family has been studying local wildlife intelligence for 3 generations. Old-timers say they've been selectively tracking the smartest bears for decades before any enhancements were attempted. You might want to ask how much of Stella's intelligence was already there naturally. Mason stared at the photo, pieces clicking into place. Reynolds said they were continuing my work. But what if it was the other way around? What if the bears I was rehabilitating had already been selectively observed for generations because they showed unusual intelligence? You think Stella was special before any experimentation? Emma asked, understanding immediately. It would explain why she remembered me, why she sought me out specifically. Mason paced the porch, mind racing. Bears can have territories spanning generations. If Reynolds's family had been studying particularly intelligent bears in these mountains for decades, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from inside the cabin. Mason rushed in to find Nova standing beside a shattered picture frame, looking remarkably contrite. The frame had contained his Wildlife Conservation Center credentials, and beneath the broken glass lay a small key that had been hidden behind the document. "What's that?" Emma asked, watching as Mason carefully retrieved the key. "Safety deposit box key," Mason replied, turning it over in his fingers. "From when I left the center, I saved some research backups in case I ever needed to prove what was happening there." He looked at Nova with amazement. How did she know to break that specific frame? Stella, who had been resting near the wood stove, rose and approached, her intelligent gaze moving between Mason and the key. The implication was impossible, yet undeniable. She had somehow directed Nova to reveal the hidden key. "We need to get to that safety deposit box," Emma said, her legal mind already processing implications. "If you have evidence of early cognitive research at the center, it could completely change the legal framework of this case." Mason nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "We'll go tomorrow, first thing." That night, Mason found himself unable to sleep, his thoughts circling between Elizabeth's condition, the mystery of the bear's intelligence, and Emma's presence under his roof after so many years apart. Around midnight, he gave up on rest and stepped onto the porch with a cup of tea. To his surprise, Emma was already there, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill, staring at the star-filled Montana sky. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Too much happening," she admitted. "Mind won't shut off." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the forest night surrounding them. Finally, Mason gathered his courage to address what Elizabeth had urged. "I owe you an apology, Emma," he said quietly. "After your mother left, I was so focused on my work, on proving I was right about the research ethics violations, that I didn't see how much you needed me." Emma was silent for a long moment. "I was so angry," she finally admitted. "Mom left, and then it felt like you chose the animals over me too." "Never," Mason insisted. "I just didn't know how to balance everything." "By the time I realized what I'd done, you were already grown and gone." He hesitated, then added, "When I saw your name on the news segment about wildlife protection law, I was so proud, still am." Emma's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "I became a wildlife attorney because of you, you know." All those lessons about respecting nature, about fighting for what's right even when it's hard, they stuck. I just needed to find my own way to live them. The conversation might have continued, but a sound from the tree line drew their attention. Stella had emerged from the shadows and was watching them, her massive form silvered by moonlight. As they observed, she deliberately approached a wild rose bush growing near the cabin, carefully selected a bloom despite the thorns, and brought it to the porch steps, depositing it gently before retreating. The gesture was so unexpected, so touching in its deliberate kindness, that Emma gave a soft gasp. "Did she just bring us a peace offering?" Mason finished, equally amazed. "I think she did." The moment crystallized everything that made their situation so extraordinary and so challenging. This was no ordinary bear making a random movement. This was a conscious act of communication from one species to another, a bridge across an evolutionary divide that humans had always considered uncrossable. The next morning brought sobering news. Howard called to report that Elizabeth had suffered a second cardiac episode overnight. "Doctors don't think she'll last the week," he said, his voice breaking. "She's asking for you again, and for Emma." Mason and Emma drove to the hospital immediately, leaving Stella and Nova with strict instructions to remain in the cabin, instructions that, remarkably, the bears seemed to understand. They arrived to find Elizabeth conscious but dramatically weaker than the day before. Her breathing labored despite oxygen assistance. "There you are," she whispered when they entered, her voice barely audible. "Both of you. Good." Mason took one of her hands while Emma held the other. "We're here, Elizabeth," he assured her. "Just rest." Elizabeth shook her head slightly. "No time for rest. Too much to do still." Her eyes, though clouded with medication, remained determined. "Did you make peace?" Mason and Emma exchanged glances. "We're working on it," Emma answered honestly. A faint smile crossed Elizabeth's pale lips. "Good. Family's too precious to waste." She drew a labored breath. "And the bears? Have you decided what to do?" "Not yet," Mason admitted. "But we found something that might help their case. Evidence that Stella's family may have shown unusual intelligence naturally, before any experimentation." Elizabeth nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected. Nature has more mysteries than science can explain. Her gaze drifted to the window where afternoon sunlight streamed in. "When my Harold was dying, a pair of cardinals appeared outside his hospital window. Sat there every day until he passed. He said they were coming to guide him home." Her focus returned to Mason. "Some connections cross boundaries we don't understand." A nurse entered to check Elizabeth's vital signs, frowning slightly at the readings. "Mrs. Hayes needs rest now," she said gently but firmly. "You can come back this evening." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth gripped Mason's hand with surprising strength. "The answer's in the forest," she whispered urgently. "Where they belong. Trust them to show you." Throughout the drive back to the cabin, Elizabeth's cryptic words echoed in Mason's mind. "The answer's in the forest. Trust them to show you." He was still pondering their meaning when they arrived to find Ranger Thompson's truck in the driveway, the ranger himself pacing anxiously on the porch. "There you are," Thompson said with evident relief. "We've got a problem." Fish and Wildlife has made its decision about the bears. They're being transferred to a federal research facility in Colorado tomorrow morning. "What?" Mason demanded. "Based on what authority?" "Executive decision citing national security implications of cognitively enhanced wildlife," Thompson replied grimly. "Reynolds must have friends in high places. They're sending a specialized transport team at dawn." Emma immediately pulled out her phone. "I'll call Judge Friedman. Our injunction should prevent this." "They've overridden it," Thompson explained. "Classified research exemption. I'm not even supposed to be warning you. I could lose my badge for this." He looked genuinely distressed. "I'm sorry, Mason. They're claiming these bears present unique opportunities for understanding enhanced animal cognition that could benefit military and intelligence applications. They're not research subjects, Mason protested. They're living beings who've already been experimented on against their will. Thompson nodded sympathetically. I know. That's why I'm here giving you advance warning instead of following orders. He glanced at his watch. I need to get back before they realize I've tipped you off. Whatever you're going to do it fast. After Thompson left, Mason and Emma faced each other with growing desperation. If they take them to a research facility, Emma began. They'll never leave, Mason finished. They'll spend their lives in cages being studied and tested. He paced the cabin, fury and helplessness warring within him. I promised Elizabeth they'd have a chance at a natural life. What options do we have? Emma asked pragmatically. Legally, we're outmaneuvered. Hiding them somewhere might buy time, but eventually... Mason stopped suddenly, Elizabeth's words clicking into place. The answer's in the forest, where they belong. He turned to Emma with growing certainty. She wasn't being cryptic. She was being literal. The bears need to return to the wild, to the deep forest where even federal agents can't easily find them. Can they survive? Emma questioned. After all they've been through, after the cognitive changes? Stella survived in the wild before she was captured for experimentation, Mason pointed out. And now she's even smarter, with even better problem-solving abilities. Plus, she sought me out across miles of wilderness while injured and carrying Nova. She knows these forests. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing. Mason gathered medical supplies, special food and tracking equipment he could use to monitor the bears from a distance. Emma drove into town to fill Elizabeth's car with gas and purchase additional supplies, careful to use cash and avoid mentioning their plans to anyone. As dusk approached, Mason sat with Stella and Nova on the porch, attempting to communicate their situation as clearly as possible. He showed Stella maps of the national forest, pointing to remote areas far from human habitation. He demonstrated the small, non-invasive tracking collar he wanted her to wear so he could ensure their safety from a distance. Throughout his explanation, Stella watched with that unnerving intelligence, her eyes tracking his fingers on the map, her attention never wavering. Nova played nearby, occasionally approaching to investigate the collar or maps before returning to her games. I don't know if you understand everything I'm saying, Mason told Stella, but tomorrow men will come to take you away to a laboratory. We need to leave tonight, to take you deep into the forest where they can't find you. As if in response, Stella rose and approached the map, placing one massive paw deliberately on a specific area, a remote valley nearly 30 miles into the wilderness, accessible only by hiking trails that would be impassable to vehicles. Mason stared in amazement. Are you showing me where you want to go? Stella held his gaze steadily, and in that moment Mason felt the weight of the extraordinary trust this wild creature had placed in him, first bringing her cub for healing, now accepting his guidance for their future. By nightfall, they were ready. Mason loaded his truck with supplies, while Emma prepared a false trail, arranging to have Sarah drive Mason's vehicle toward Bozeman the next day, suggesting the bears had been relocated. With the tracking collar secured comfortably around Stella's neck, they set out under cover of darkness, Mason driving Elizabeth's less recognizable pickup along logging roads as far as they could go. The last 5 miles required hiking through dense forest by moonlight. Mason carried Nova in a specialized backpack, while Stella moved silently alongside them, occasionally pausing to indicate the best path through difficult terrain. Her knowledge of the forest was evident in every choice she made, avoiding loose rocks, selecting sheltered routes, finding small streams for water breaks. Near midnight, they reached the valley Stella had indicated on the map. Protected by steep ridges on 3 sides and a fast-moving river on the 4th, it offered natural security and abundant resources. berry bushes, fish-filled streams, and dense forest cover. Mason set up a small base camp from which he could monitor the bears for a few days before leaving them to truly return to the wild. As he unfolded a thermal blanket for Nova, his phone vibrated with a text from Howard. Elizabeth passed peacefully at 11:42 p.m. Her last words were, "Tell Mason, trust the forest." Grief washed over him, the loss of his friend hitting harder than expected. Mason sat heavily on a fallen log, showing Emma the message. She joined him in silent mourning, both acknowledging the profound impact Elizabeth had made in their lives in such a short time. Stella approached quietly, seeming to sense their sadness. In a gesture that defied all normal bear behavior, she gently placed her massive head against Mason's shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture of comfort so human-like it brought tears to his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, understanding that Elizabeth had been right. The answer was indeed in the forest, not just as a location, but as a philosophy. These bears belonged to the natural world, enhanced intelligence or not. Their best chance wasn't in human captivity or control, but in the freedom of their ancient home. As dawn broke over the valley, Mason and Emma prepared to leave the bears in their new territory. Nova had already begun exploring, her playful energy returning in the natural setting. Stella watched over her while simultaneously observing Mason's preparations for departure. "We'll come check on you in a few days," Mason promised her. "The collar will let us know you're safe." Stella approached as they prepared to leave, and to Mason's astonishment, she deliberately rose on her hind legs, a posture rarely used by black bears except in specific circumstances. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, she looked directly into Mason's eyes, communicating something profound without words. Then she lowered herself and gently nudged Nova toward a berry bush, beginning the instruction that would help her cub survive in this wilderness. It was a clear message. "I understand. We will be fine. This is where we belong." As Mason and Emma hiked away, periodically looking back to see the bears growing smaller in the distance, Emma finally asked the question that had been troubling her since the beginning. "What happens when people find out where they are?" "Someone will eventually track them, try to capture them for study or worse." Mason paused on the trail, looking back at the valley now partly obscured by morning mist. "I don't think they will," he said with surprising confidence. "Stella is smarter than any bear tracker. She knows how to avoid humans when she wants to, how to disappear into the wilderness." He smiled slightly. "And I suspect she's not the only unusually intelligent bear in these mountains. Reynolds' family had been studying them for generations, remember?" Emma considered this. "You think there are others? Bears with natural intelligence beyond what we've recognized?" "I think," Mason replied carefully, "that humans are often too arrogant to recognize intelligence that doesn't mirror our own. These mountains have held secrets for millennia. Stella and Nova are just two we happen to meet." As they continued their journey back to civilization, Mason carried with him grief for Elizabeth, concern for the bear's future, and a profound sense that he had witnessed something that would forever change his understanding of the relationship between humans and wildlife. The easy categories of wild and tame, of animal intelligence and human intelligence, had been permanently blurred. Back at the cabin that afternoon, they found federal agents and Mont Bio staff searching the property, their frustration evident in their aggressive movements and sharp questions. Mason and Emma maintained that the bears had escaped again, likely heading deep into the national forest where they would be impossible to track. "They're wild animals," Mason told Agent Holloway with perfect truthfulness. "They belong in the wilderness, not in laboratories." By evening, the federal team had departed empty-handed, leaving behind threats of legal consequences that both Mason and Emma knew would be difficult to pursue without the actual bears as evidence. As quiet returned to the cabin, Mason found himself staring at the simple wooden bear carving Elizabeth had given him weeks earlier. "What now?" Emma asked, joining him on the porch with mugs of hot chocolate. Mason considered the question, watching the sun set over the mountains that now sheltered Stella and Nova. "Now we make sure their story helps change things. We use what we've learned about animal intelligence to advocate for better protection, more ethical research protocols." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I've already been contacted by 3 environmental law groups wanting to use this case as precedent for strengthening wildlife experimentation regulations." "And personally?" Mason asked hesitantly. "After all this is settled?" Emma's expression softened. "I was thinking I might look for opportunities closer to Montana. Colorado's nice, but—" She gestured toward the mountains. "Something about these forests feels like home." Mason felt a surge of hope, not just for the bears hidden safely in the wilderness, but for the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken in his own family. Elizabeth would have approved. 3 days later, they gathered with the community to celebrate Elizabeth's life. The small church overflowed with people whose lives she had touched, including Howard, Sarah, the Wilson twins, and dozens of other seniors who had rallied to protect the bears. After the service, Mason checked the tracking data on his phone. Stella and Nova had traveled deeper into the valley, establishing a territory around a series of caves ideal for winter denning. They were adapting, surviving, free in the world where they belonged. As Mason and Emma drove back to the cabin, a local news report on the radio announced that Dr. Victor Reynolds had resigned from Mont Bio following congressional inquiries into unauthorized animal experimentation. The company's government contracts were under review, and a special oversight committee had been established to investigate similar research at other facilities. "It's a start," Emma commented. "Not justice exactly, but accountability." Mason nodded, thinking of Stella's intelligent eyes, of Nova's playful spirit, of Elizabeth's unwavering certainty that all creatures deserve dignity. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important victories aren't about justice. They're about freedom." The foreclosure on Mason's cabin had been suspended following an anonymous donation that covered his outstanding mortgage payments, a mystery Mason suspected might be traced to Reynolds's personal attempt at atonement. Whatever the source, it meant he could remain in his home, close enough to monitor the bears occasionally without interfering in their return to natural life. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Mason felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but a turning point. Somewhere in the distant forest, Stella and Nova were beginning their new lives, carrying within them a bridge between human and animal worlds that few would ever understand, but that had forever changed those who witnessed it. The tragedy of their captivity and experimentation had transformed into something unexpected, a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of freedom, and to connections that transcended the boundaries humans too often believed were fixed and impermeable. 3 months passed, with autumn painting the Montana forests in vibrant golds and deep reds. Mason settled into a new routine, dividing his time between consulting on the federal investigation into Mont Bio and making discreet trips to monitor Stella and Nova from a distance. The tracking collar showed they had established a territory in the remote valley, their movements indicating healthy adaptation to fully wild living. The congressional hearings into Mont Bio's research had become national news, with Reynolds testifying about decades of secret cognitive enhancement studies. Mason had been called as an expert witness twice, his testimony helping shape new legislation on wildlife research protections. Each time he returned to Montana, feeling both exhausted and cautiously hopeful that some good might emerge from the ordeal. Emma had relocated to Bozeman, taking a position with a wildlife advocacy firm that allowed her to work on the legal aftermath of the Montbio case while remaining close enough for weekly visits to Mason's cabin. Their relationship had healed gradually, old wounds closing as they focused on protecting the legacy of what they'd experienced with the bears. On a crisp October morning, Mason sat reviewing footage from his most recent observation trip. Discreet camera traps placed near the edges of Stella's territory captured mother and cub, foraging, playing, and clearly thriving. Nova had nearly doubled in size, her movements increasingly confident as she learned survival skills from her extraordinary mother. A knock at the door interrupted his viewing. Mason opened it to find Dr. Victor Reynolds standing on his porch, looking markedly different from their last encounter. Gone was the imperious research director in tailored suits. This Reynolds wore hiking clothes and carried a simple backpack, his face weathered by stress and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Mason," he said simply, "may I come in?" After a moment's hesitation, Mason stepped aside. The two men had not spoken privately since the confrontation months earlier, their only interaction coming during formal testimony where professional courtesy masked the deeper currents between them. Reynolds settled at the kitchen table, declining coffee with a shake of his head. "I won't take much of your time. I'm leaving Montana tomorrow, permanently. The Institute's board has accepted my resignation, and I've agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigations." "I know," Mason replied neutrally. "I read your public statement." Reynolds nodded, his hands clasped before him. "What you don't know is that I've also provided federal investigators with all my family's research dating back to my grandfather's work in the 1940s. He met Mason's eyes directly. "3 generations of studying bear cognition in these mountains, Mason. My grandfather recognized something special in certain bear lineages here. Unusual problem-solving abilities, complex social behaviors, tool usage beyond anything documented elsewhere." "Stella's lineage," Mason surmised. "Yes. Her grandmother was one of the first bears my father tracked continuously back when I was a boy." Reynolds reached into his pack, retrieving a worn leather journal. "This is my father's original field notebook. He called them the philosopher bears, black bears with cognitive abilities that defied conventional understanding." Mason accepted the journal with cautious curiosity. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you were right," Reynolds admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "We took something remarkable that existed naturally and tried to quantify it, control it, enhance it, not for the bear's benefit but for human application. My father would have been ashamed." He paused, visibly gathering himself. "And because I know they're not at the research facility in Colorado where everyone believes they were transferred." Mason tensed, but Reynolds raised a placating hand. "I'm not here to discover their location. In fact, I've been helping maintain that fiction to keep other interested parties from looking too hard. Some military contractors were very invested in our research results." The revelation of Reynolds's quiet assistance surprised Mason. "Why would you help protect them after everything?" Reynolds stared out the window toward the distant mountains. "When I saw Stella on your porch that day, the way she looked at me, I realized what we'd become in our pursuit of knowledge. She recognized me, Mason, not just as a human, but as the specific human who had caused her pain." His voice dropped nearly to a whisper. "No animal should be able to look at you with that level of conscious judgment, that we enabled it and then abused it. There's no scientific justification that absolves that sin." Mason studied his former colleague, seeing past the distinguished scientist to the conflicted man beneath. "What will you do now?" "Teach ethics in biological research at a small college in Vermont. Try to ensure the next generation of scientists understands boundaries better than I did." Reynolds stood, preparing to leave. The journal contains maps of traditional territories for bears in Stella's lineage. It might help you monitor their welfare from a distance. As Reynolds reached the door, he turned back. One last thing. There's a theory in my father's later writings. He believed these cognitively advanced bears deliberately avoid human detection, that they've been hiding their true capabilities for generations as an evolutionary strategy. That what we witnessed with Stella wasn't entirely our creation, but the revelation of something that was already there, awakened rather than installed. He offered a sad smile. Perhaps some mysteries belong to the wilderness, not in our laboratories. After Reynolds departed, Mason pored over the journal, discovering decades of meticulous observations documenting behaviors that defied conventional understanding of bear cognition, tool usage, problem solving, even rudimentary symbolic communication between certain bears. Most remarkably, the territories mapped in the journal included the very valley where Stella and Nova had established their new home, suggesting some ancestral memory might have guided Stella's choice. That evening, Emma arrived for her weekend visit, listening intently as Mason shared Reynolds's revelations. They sat on the porch with the journal open between them, processing the implications of generations of extraordinary bears living largely undetected in these mountains. If Reynolds's father was right, Emma mused, then what we witnessed wasn't just the result of experimental enhancement, but the unveiling of natural capabilities these bears have been concealing. It would explain why Stella sought me out specifically, Mason agreed. Not just random chance or basic memory, but a conscious decision based on our prior relationship during her rehabilitation. The possibility felt simultaneously unsettling and wondrous, that humans might have been sharing these forests with far more intelligent neighbors than they'd ever recognized, that the boundaries between species might be more permeable than science had acknowledged. Their conversation was interrupted by Mason's satellite phone, the emergency line few people had the number for. He answered to find Ranger Thompson on the line, his voice urgent. "Mason, we've got a situation. A film crew from National Geographic somehow got wind of unusual bear behavior in the North Valley region. They've been shooting footage for 3 days already." Mason felt his blood run cold. "How close are they to Stella's territory?" "Too close for comfort," Thompson replied grimly. "I've been trying to redirect them with talk of better filming opportunities elsewhere, but they're determined. Their guide showed me some footage from yesterday. Mason, they captured images of Nova doing things no normal bear cub would do, arranging stones in patterns while Stella watched." "Damn it," Mason muttered. "If that footage gets out—" "Exactly. Every research institution and wildlife paparazzi in the country will descend on these mountains looking for them." Thompson paused. "I can delay them another day, maybe 2 at most. After that—" "I understand. Thanks for the warning." Mason ended the call and immediately began gathering equipment. "We need to move them," he told Emma. "Deeper into the wilderness, somewhere film crews can't easily access." "Can we even find them quickly enough?" Emma asked, already helping collect supplies. "That valley covers miles of territory." Mason checked the tracking data on his tablet. "The collar shows they've been denning near the eastern ridge for the past week. If we leave now and hike through the night, we can reach them by morning." They drove through dusk toward the National Forest trailhead, Mason's truck loaded with hiking gear and emergency supplies. The October night brought freezing temperatures as they navigated the forest trails by headlamp, pushing themselves to maintain a punishing pace through increasingly difficult terrain. Near midnight, Emma voiced the concern that had been building between them. "Even if we reach them in time, how do we convince a 1,000-pound wild bear to relocate? We can't exactly explain documentary filmmakers and privacy concerns." "Stella understood when we moved them the first time," Mason reminded her, though doubt tinged his voice. "She recognized the danger then. That was different. Immediate threat. Federal agents coming specifically for them. This is more abstract. Mason had no answer, but continued pressing forward through the darkness, guided by stars and topographical maps. By dawn, exhaustion dragged at their movements as they approached the ridgeline overlooking Stella's territory. The tracking signal led them to a small clearing near a cave entrance, but the site appeared recently abandoned, fresh paw prints leading away toward the deeper wilderness, broken branches indicating hasty departure. Mason checked the tracking data with confusion. The collar shows she should be right here, but these tracks are heading northwest. Emma examined the ground with growing concern. Mason, these prints, there are more than 2 bears here. Look at the size differences. She was right. Among Stella and Nova's distinctive tracks were prints from at least 3 other bears, 2 large adults and what appeared to be an adolescent. More disturbing was what Mason found near the cave entrance. The tracking collar, removed and deliberately placed atop a pile of specific medicinal plants they had once used to treat Nova. She took it off, Mason said incredulously. Somehow she removed the collar herself and left it with these plants, the same ones she brought to your porch for Nova's treatment, Emma added. That's not random, Mason. That's a message. As the implications settled between them, Mason spotted something else. A pattern of stones near the cave entrance, carefully arranged in a formation that triggered an immediate memory. He pulled out Reynolds' journal, flipping to a page he'd studied the night before. "Look at this," he said, showing Emma a sketch from 30 years earlier, a nearly identical stone arrangement documented by Reynolds' father. He wrote that bears from Stella's lineage would create this pattern near territory boundaries when they perceived a threat and needed to relocate. Are you saying she recognized potential exposure from the film crew and deliberately left us a message that they were moving to safer territory? Emma's voice held equal parts wonder and disbelief. Before Mason could respond, movement in the trees caught their attention. A large male black bear emerged briefly at the forest edge, watching them with unmistakable intentionality before disappearing back into the dense vegetation. Unlike Stella, this bear bore no signs of human intervention or experimentation, just a wild bear behaving in decidedly unwild ways. Reynolds' father was right, Mason whispered. There are more of them. Naturally intelligent bears that have been hiding in these mountains, concealing their true capabilities from human observation. The realization settled over them with profound weight, that what they had witnessed with Stella and Nova wasn't simply the result of Montbio's experimentation, but the amplification of natural abilities present in a lineage of bears that had been carefully concealing their intelligence from human detection for generations. They spent the day searching for further signs, finding occasional tracks that suggested Stella and Nova had indeed joined a small group of bears moving into more remote wilderness. By afternoon, they reached a ridgeline overlooking a valley so inaccessible that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. Through binoculars, Mason caught a glimpse of movement, a black form moving deliberately through distant trees, followed by a smaller shape. Though too far for positive identification, he felt certain it was Stella and Nova traveling with their newfound companions to a sanctuary beyond human intrusion. "We shouldn't follow them," Emma said quietly, giving voice to what Mason already felt. "This is their choice, their world." Mason nodded, lowering the binoculars. "All this time we've been worried about protecting them from humans, but maybe they've been protecting themselves for generations." He turned away from the valley view. "We should go back, help Thompson misdirect that film crew." The hike back was slower, both physically taxing and emotionally complex. They had come to save Stella and Nova, only to discover the bears had saved themselves, had perhaps never needed saving in the way humans conceived it. What do we do with this knowledge? Emma asked as they neared the trailhead that evening. About bears with this level of intelligence living secretly in these mountains? Mason considered the question carefully. We protect the secret, he decided. We use what we know about Montbio's experiments to establish stronger wildlife protections, but we don't expose what we've discovered about natural bear intelligence. Some mysteries belong to the wilderness, like Reynolds said. 2 days later, Mason met with the National Geographic team, using his wildlife veterinary expertise to convince them that the behaviors they documented were likely stress responses in bears previously rehabilitated after human contact. He guided them to a different area of the forest where more typical bear activities would provide better filming opportunities, steering them away from the deep wilderness where Stella and her kind had retreated. As autumn deepened toward winter, Mason found unexpected peace in knowing Stella and Nova had found their true place, not as subjects of human study or protection, but as members of a community that understood them in ways humans never could. He continued his consulting work on wildlife protection legislation, using the Montbio case to strengthen legal safeguards without ever revealing the full truth of what he had witnessed. Emma relocated permanently to Bozeman, her wildlife advocacy firm expanding to focus on ethical treatment of animals in research settings. She visited the cabin regularly, their relationship healing more with each shared meal and fireside conversation. Sometimes they hiked the forest trails, never venturing near Stella's new territory, but drawing comfort from the knowledge that somewhere in these mountains, extraordinary minds were living lives beyond human understanding. The first snow of winter had just dusted the forest when Mason found it. A small, perfect pine cone placed precisely in the center of his porch, surrounded by a circle of red berries. Not scattered randomly as nature might arrange, but deliberately positioned in a pattern identical to the stone formation they had found near Stella's abandoned den. Mason stared at the arrangement, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just nature. It was communication. A message from one intelligent being to another across the species divide. "I understand," he whispered to the empty forest. "Your secret is safe with us." That night, as snowflakes drifted past his window, Mason added his own observations to Reynolds's family journal, continuing the multi-generational chronicle of the remarkable bears of Montana's wilderness. Unlike his predecessors, however, he wrote not as a scientist documenting subjects, but as a humble witness to a mystery greater than human comprehension. The possibility that consciousness and intelligence had taken forms in these mountains that science had neither recognized nor respected. He ended his entry with words that he knew would never appear in scientific journals or congressional testimony, but that represented the profound truth he had come to accept. Perhaps the most intelligent response to human presence is to hide one's intelligence. Stella and her kind have not merely survived alongside humanity, they have developed the wisdom to conceal their true nature from those who might exploit it. In doing so, they have achieved something we humans, with all our technology and supposed advancement, have yet to master: the ability to live in harmony with the world rather than attempting to control it. When Emma arrived for Thanksgiving dinner the following week, Mason showed her the pine cone arrangement and his journal entry. She studied both with quiet reverence before adding her own reflection beneath his. The greatest act of respect we can offer is not to study them, but to let them be, to protect not just their physical habitat, but their right to mysteries we haven't earned the privilege to share. Together they stepped onto the porch, watching night fall over the forest that now held a deeper magic than either had imagined possible. Somewhere in the distant wilderness beyond human reach, Stella and Nova were preparing for their first winter in true freedom, not as refugees from human experimentation, but as rightful inheritors of an ancient wisdom that had been flowing through their lineage long before humans conceived of cognitive enhancement or neural research. And in that knowledge, Mason found not disappointment that the bears had chosen to leave human contact behind, but profound hope that some relationships transcended conventional understanding, that connections made in trust and compassion could echo across species boundaries in ways science might never fully explain, but the heart could nevertheless recognize. Spring arrived in Montana with a riot of wildflowers and the gentle greening of the forest. Nearly 6 months had passed since Mason had last seen any sign of Stella and Nova, though the occasional arrangement of pine cones or berries on his porch suggested they hadn't forgotten him. Each small offering appeared after storms or significant events. One the day after the congressional hearing concluded with sweeping new protections for wildlife in research settings. Another following Emma's televised interview about ethical treatment of animals. Mason had settled into a new routine. 3 days a week, he consulted remotely for the newly established Wildlife Research Ethics Commission born from the Montbio scandal. The remainder of his time he devoted to writing a book about animal cognition and ethical stewardship, carefully omitting the full truth about Stella's lineage while advocating for more respectful approaches to wildlife research. His mortgage now paid through an anonymous donation, which Mason strongly suspected came from Reynolds, financial pressures had eased, allowing him to focus on work that mattered. Emma had flourished in Bozeman, her law firm expanding as cases involving animal welfare and research ethics multiplied in the wake of the Montbio revelations. She visited every weekend, their relationship healing through shared purpose and the profound experience they'd navigated together. Sometimes they hiked through the awakening forest, careful to avoid the remote territories where they believed Stella's group had established themselves, respecting the boundaries between their worlds. On a warm April morning, Mason sat on his porch reviewing the final edits for his book manuscript when a familiar truck appeared on his driveway. Ranger Thompson's Forest Service vehicle, followed by a sleek government SUV Mason didn't recognize. Thompson approached with an expression Mason couldn't quite read, concern mingled with something else. Behind him walked a distinguished woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her posture suggesting military background despite her civilian clothes. "Mason," Thompson greeted him. "This is Dr. Margaret Blackwood from the Department of Interior. She's heading up the Special Committee on Wildlife Intelligence Research following the Montbio case." Mason shook her hand cautiously. Her grip was firm, her gaze direct and evaluating. "Dr. Parker, your testimony was instrumental in reshaping our wildlife research protocols. I've been hoping to speak with you directly." "What can I help you with, Dr. Blackwood?" Mason asked, inviting them to sit on the porch while maintaining his guard. Government officials arriving unannounced rarely brought good news. Blackwood declined the offered chair, remaining standing as she studied Mason with unnerving intensity. "Yeah, I'll be direct, Dr. Parker. Satellite monitoring has detected unusual activity patterns among black bear populations in the northern sector of the Wilderness Preserve. Movement patterns that suggest coordinated behavior rather than random foraging." Mason kept his expression neutral. Bears often follow similar patterns based on food availability or territorial habits. These patterns include what appear to be deliberate boundary markings and regular gatherings of multiple adult bears, behaviors inconsistent with normal black bear social structures. She paused, watching Mason carefully. "We've also documented unusual arrangements of stones and plant materials at abandoned den sites." Thompson shifted uncomfortably beside her. "I told Dr. Blackwood these could be explained by natural phenomena, water movement, other animal activity." "But you don't believe that explanation, do you, Ranger Thompson?" Blackwood asked without looking at him. Her focus remained on Mason. "Just as Dr. Parker doesn't." A tense silence settled over the porch. Mason chose his words with extreme care. Dr. Blackwood, what exactly are you suggesting? I believe Stella and Nova were not the only cognitively enhanced bears from Montbio's program, she stated flatly. And I believe you know where they are. Mason felt a chill despite the warm spring air. The official record shows they were transferred to a research facility in Colorado, a fiction maintained by several parties, including, surprisingly, Dr. Reynolds himself. Blackwood's smile held no warmth. My committee has been tasked with locating all subjects from unauthorized enhancement programs to ensure proper monitoring and protection. Protection? Mason couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Or continued research? Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. These animals represent a unique scientific resource, Dr. Parker. Their cognitive capabilities could provide insights into neural development, interspecies communication, even medical applications for cognitive disorders. Surely, as a scientist yourself, you understand the value of such research potential. I understand the value of leaving them in peace, Mason countered. These bears have been through enough experimentation. Blackwood studied him for a long moment before reaching into her jacket pocket and producing several photographs. She laid them on the small table between them, high-resolution satellite images showing what appeared to be deliberate formations of rocks and logs in remote clearings, arranged in patterns too precise to be random. These were taken last month in the northern wilderness region, she explained. Our analysts believe they're communication markers of some kind, similar to patterns documented in Reynolds' family research that was recently added to our database. She fixed Mason with a penetrating stare. We know they're out there, Dr. Parker, and we know they're not just ordinary bears affected by Montbio's experiments. They're something more. Mason felt trapped between truth and necessary deception. Acknowledging the full reality of Stella's lineage and the naturally intelligent bears of these mountains would only intensify government interest. Denying it entirely would be transparent falsehood given the evidence Blackwood clearly possessed. Dr. Blackwood, he said finally, even if Stella and Nova did escape into the wilderness rather than being transferred to Colorado, pursuing them now would be both practically difficult and ethically questionable. These mountains contain thousands of square miles of remote terrain. Bears are notoriously good at avoiding human contact when they choose to, which is why we need your help, Blackwood pressed. Your connection with these animals gives us the best chance of establishing non-invasive observation protocols. Think of the scientific possibilities, Dr. Parker, ethical, respectful research that could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition. The most ethical approach would be to leave them alone, Mason insisted. They've chosen their path. Blackwood's expression shifted subtly, compassion briefly replacing scientific determination. I understand your protective instinct, Dr. Parker, but consider the larger implications. If these bears truly possess the level of intelligence we suspect, they represent a profound evolutionary development, possibly accelerated by human intervention but rooted in natural potential. Don't they deserve to have their story told, their capabilities recognized? At what cost to their freedom? Mason challenged. Recognition by humans has rarely benefited wildlife in the long run. The conversation might have continued in this philosophical standoff, but a movement at the forest edge caught their attention. Mason turned to see Emma's car approaching, returning early from her trip to Bozeman. Blackwood noticed his distraction and followed his gaze. Your daughter, I believe? Emma Parker, the wildlife attorney. I was hoping to speak with her as well. Mason felt his protective instincts rise. Dr. Blackwood, I appreciate your scientific curiosity, but I have nothing more to offer regarding the whereabouts of any bears from Montbio's program. If that's all you came for, I'm afraid you've wasted your trip. Blackwood gathered her photographs with deliberate movements. I didn't expect immediate cooperation, Dr. Parker, but I want you to consider something. If we don't establish protected study protocols for these animals, others will eventually find them. Military contractors were very interested in MontBio's research results. Private companies would pay millions for access to cognitively enhanced wildlife. At least our department is bound by ethical oversight and transparency requirements. The implicit threat hung in the air as Emma parked and approached the gathering with cautious curiosity. Mason made brief introductions, watching his daughter shift seamlessly into her professional legal persona as she assessed the situation. Dr. Blackwood is interested in locating bears from MontBio's program, Mason explained carefully, for scientific study. Emma's expression revealed nothing, though Mason knew she immediately understood the dangerous implications. Any such research would require extensive permit applications and ethical review, she noted professionally, particularly given the pending legislation inspired by the MontBio case. Legislation your firm has been instrumental in drafting, Blackwood acknowledged with respect. I assure you, Ms. Parker, my committee operates with full transparency and ethical oversight. We're not MontBio. Then you'll understand why Dr. Parker and I would need to see detailed research protocols, oversight committee membership, and intended applications before discussing potential wildlife locations, Emma countered smoothly, as well as legal guarantees regarding the animal's welfare and autonomy. Blackwood's smile suggested both frustration and admiration for Emma's tactical approach. Of course, I'll have my office forward the complete documentation. She handed Mason her card. Please consider my proposal carefully, Dr. Parker. These bears represent an unprecedented opportunity to bridge understanding between species. With your help, we could establish a new paradigm for respectful wildlife research. After Blackwood and Thompson departed, Mason and Emma sat in tense silence on the porch, processing the implications of the visit. They know, Emma said finally. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous. Mason nodded grimly. Satellite technology, pattern recognition software, it was inevitable they'd detect something unusual eventually. Stella's group isn't hiding their intelligence as completely as their ancestors did. Or they're deliberately becoming more visible, Emma suggested thoughtfully. Reynolds's journal mentioned periods of greater visibility historically coinciding with human threats to their territory. Logging operations, mining exploration. You think they're responding to some new threat? Mason asked. It's worth investigating. Emma pulled out her laptop. I'll check recent land use applications, resource surveys in the region. By evening, their research had yielded disturbing results. A Canadian mining company had filed preliminary exploration permits for the northern wilderness region, precisely where Blackwood's satellite images had shown unusual bear activity. The proposed operation would involve extensive road construction and test drilling in pristine habitat. This explains the communication markers, Mason realized. They're responding to the survey teams, perhaps coordinating their movements to establish presence throughout the threatened territory. Which also explains why Blackwood's department detected them, Emma added. They're being more visible because remaining hidden would mean losing their homeland. The discovery presented a painful dilemma. Drawing attention to the bears' unusual behaviors might help protect their territory from mining development through endangered species provisions, but would simultaneously expose them to the very government research interest Blackwood represented. There has to be another way, Mason insisted. Some legal protection that doesn't require revealing their true nature. Emma considered this thoughtfully. What if we shift the focus entirely? Instead of the bears themselves being the protected element, what if we protect the entire ecosystem they inhabit? The idea blossomed between them through the evening, a proposal to establish a special conservation zone based not on any single species, but on the unique ecological interactions of the northern wilderness. Emma knew precisely which legal frameworks to leverage, while Mason could provide the scientific justification through documented biodiversity studies. It would require political support, Emma cautioned, and substantial public advocacy. Elizabeth's senior network, Mason suggested immediately. They've become quite the effective lobbying force since our bear adventure. And Howard has connections in the state legislature. By midnight, they had drafted the framework for what they called the Northern Wilderness Heritage Preserve, a proposed designation that would prohibit extractive industry while permitting limited scientific research under strict ethical guidelines. Most importantly, it would protect the entire ecosystem without specifically highlighting the bear's unusual characteristics. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah Mitchell arrived with urgent news. "One of my clients spotted bears behaving strangely near Johnson Creek," she reported. "Multiple bears working together to move fallen logs, creating what looked like deliberate barriers across old logging roads leading into the northern valley." Mason and Emma exchanged concerned glances. The bears were becoming increasingly visible in their efforts to protect their territory, a dangerous strategy that risked broader exposure. "We need to accelerate our preserve proposal," Emma decided, "before Blackwood's team or the mining company make their next moves." The following weeks became a whirlwind of activity. Howard mobilized Elizabeth's senior network into a formidable advocacy force, arranging meetings with state legislators and conservation organizations. The Wilson twins leveraged their extensive social connections to generate media interest in the unique ecosystem of the northern wilderness. Mason provided scientific testimony on the biodiversity value of the region, carefully emphasizing rare plant species and watershed protection rather than unusual wildlife behaviors. Blackwood's department continued satellite monitoring, occasionally sending Thompson to investigate particularly unusual patterns, but the coordinated community effort to establish the preserve created a legitimate reason for Mason and his allies to maintain a presence in discussions about the region's future without revealing their true motivations. 6 weeks into their campaign, Emma received a call from her legal contacts in the state capitol. "The mining company pulled their permit applications," she reported to Mason with cautious optimism. "Apparently, the public attention and regulatory scrutiny made the project less appealing." "One threat down," Mason acknowledged, "but Blackwood's interest won't fade so easily." His concern proved prescient when Thompson arrived the following day with a warning. "Blackwood's team is planning a comprehensive expedition into the Northern Territory next month. Full scientific survey team with tracking equipment and surveillance technology. They're determined to document what they're calling anomalous ursine behaviors." Mason felt his heart sink. "Can you delay them?" Thompson shook his head regretfully. "They have all the necessary permits. The best I could do was insist on accompanying them as the local wildlife authority." That night, as Mason sat on his porch contemplating their dwindling options for protecting Stella's secret, he noticed movement at the forest edge. A large black form emerged cautiously from the trees. Not Stella, but another bear, older and with a distinctive silver marking across his muzzle. The bear approached with deliberate care, stopping at the edge of the clearing to deposit something on the ground before retreating to watch from a safe distance. Heart-pounding, Mason cautiously approached the offering, a complex arrangement of berries, small stones, and twigs that formed a pattern strikingly similar to the satellite images Blackwood had shown him. Beside it lay a tattered piece of orange surveyor's tape, the kind used to mark boundaries for development projects. The message seemed unmistakable. The bears were aware of human encroachment and were actively communicating their concern. More remarkable was that this messenger wasn't Stella, who had direct experience with humans, but another member of her community, evidence that knowledge of human communication was being shared among the bears. Mason photographed the arrangement carefully before looking toward the waiting bear. "I understand," he said clearly. "We're trying to protect your home." The bear watched him for a long moment before slowly, deliberately nodding its massive head in what could only be interpreted as acknowledgement. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Mason with incontrovertible personal proof of what he had long suspected. These bears possessed intelligence and communication abilities far beyond scientific recognition, abilities they were now choosing to reveal because the threat to their homeland outweighed the risk of exposure. The following morning, Mason called an emergency gathering of their core group: Emma, Sarah, Howard, and Thompson. He shared what he had witnessed, showing them the photographs and the surveyor's tape. "They're asking for our help," he concluded, directly and deliberately. "This changes everything," Emma said quietly. "If they're initiating communication, it means they've made a choice," Mason finished. "They're willing to risk exposure to protect their territory." Howard, ever practical despite his 83 years, focused on immediate implications. "Blackwood's expedition is the immediate threat. How do we address that without revealing more than necessary?" After hours of discussion, they settled on a bold approach. Instead of hiding the bear's intelligence, they would selectively reveal it, but on their own terms and through channels they could better control. Emma drafted legal documents establishing a community-based monitoring program for the northern wilderness, with Mason as lead scientific advisor and Thompson as the Forest Service liaison. The proposal, framed as a progressive approach to wildlife management with local expertise, would give them legitimate authority to establish research protocols for any scientific expeditions in the region, including Blackwood's. "We can't stop her team from going in," Emma explained, "but we can establish guidelines that protect the bear's autonomy while allowing limited observation. We control the narrative." Thompson leveraged his official position to fast-track approval of the monitoring program, while Howard's political connections ensured state-level support. By the time Blackwood arrived to personally supervise her department's expedition, she found herself required to operate within the framework Mason's team had established: limited personnel, restricted technology usage, and mandatory local guides who understood the sensitive ecological balance of the region. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood protested during the pre-expedition briefing at the Forest Service office. "My team has federal authorization for comprehensive wildlife monitoring." "Within parameters established by local conservation protocols," Emma countered smoothly, indicating the newly approved regulations. "The Northern Wilderness Heritage Initiative has been granted priority status due to its unique ecological significance." Mason watched the exchange with carefully concealed satisfaction. They couldn't prevent all scientific interest in the bears, but they could shape how that interest manifested, establishing boundaries that protected the most profound aspects of the bears' lives while allowing limited observation of behaviors the bears themselves seemed willing to demonstrate. The compromise wasn't perfect. Blackwood's team would undoubtedly document behaviors that would generate further scientific interest, but by controlling the process, Mason and his allies could ensure that interest remained respectful rather than exploitative, observational rather than interventional. As spring warmed toward summer, Blackwood's expedition proceeded under the watchful guidance of Mason and Thompson. The bears, remarkably, seemed to understand the delicate balance being maintained. They allowed themselves to be observed performing moderately unusual behaviors, cooperative foraging, simple tool usage, while reserving their most profound capabilities for moments when no research teams were present. Only Mason, visiting alone at dawn or dusk in locations far from the official observation blinds, occasionally witnessed the true extent of their intelligence: complex communication through arranged objects, sophisticated problem-solving, even what appeared to be rudimentary symbolic representations created with stones and plants. On one such solitary visit in early June, Mason finally encountered Stella again. She emerged from the forest at sunset, Nova, now nearly adult-sized, following close behind. Their reunion held no dramatic gestures, just a quiet moment of recognition between beings who had shared an extraordinary journey. Stella approached only to the edge of the small clearing where Mason waited, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged their different worlds. Nova showed more curiosity, circling halfway around Mason before rejoining her mother. Both bears appeared healthy and fully integrated into their wild existence, though their eyes still held that unsettling intelligence that separated them from ordinary bears. "I think we've found a balance," Mason told them, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking aloud. "Blackwood's team will document enough to satisfy scientific curiosity without exposing the full truth. The preserve designation is gaining support. Your home should be protected." Stella watched him with those knowing eyes, then deliberately turned her gaze toward a nearby arrangement of stones, a circle with radiating lines that Mason had come to recognize as a territorial marker. She added a small stone to the pattern, adjusting the formation slightly, before looking back at Mason. The message felt clear even without words. "Thank you, but we will continue to protect ourselves as we always have." As twilight deepened, Stella and Nova melted back into the forest, returning to their community and the ancient wisdom it preserved. Mason remained in the clearing a while longer, reflecting on the profound journey that had begun with a desperate mother bear on his porch and led to this delicate balance between revelation and protection. The full truth of these bears would likely never be known to science. Their true capabilities, their complex society, the depth of their communication. And Mason had come to believe that was exactly as it should be. Some mysteries belong to the wilderness itself, not to human knowledge. Some forms of intelligence deserve the dignity of privacy rather than the spotlight of scientific documentation. When Mason finally returned to his cabin that night, he found Emma waiting on the porch with news. "The Heritage Preserve designation passed the state legislature," she announced with quiet triumph. "The northern wilderness is protected from development for at least 50 years, with provisions for renewal." Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "So Stella's homeland is safe." "As safe as we can make it in this world," Emma agreed. And Blackwood's final report recommends minimal human intervention in the region based on preliminary observations of sensitive social structures among local wildlife. It seems even she recognizes some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. As summer blossomed fully across the mountains, Mason completed his book, not the scientific examination of enhanced animal cognition he had originally planned, but a more profound reflection on human relationships with wildlife, on respect and boundaries, on the arrogance of believing human understanding should extend to every corner of the natural world. In the final chapter, he wrote words that represented the deepest lesson from his extraordinary encounter. "Perhaps true wisdom lies not in how much we can discover about the natural world, but in recognizing when to allow its mysteries to remain uncatalogued and unexamined. In an age where humanity's reach extends to the cellular level of all living things, the most profound act of respect may be to acknowledge that some forms of intelligence, some ways of being, deserve to exist beyond our understanding, wild and free, and wholly their own." On the day he submitted the final manuscript, Mason found a perfect arrangement of summer wildflowers on his porch steps. A rainbow of colors formed into the now familiar circle with radiating lines. Beside it lay a single perfect pine cone and a small worn river stone with Nova's distinctive paw print pressed into a patch of dried mud. Mason carefully preserved these offerings in the wooden box where he kept all such gifts, a collection that told a story few would ever fully comprehend, but that represented a connection across species boundaries that had forever changed his understanding of intelligence, communication, and the profound mysteries still hidden in the wilderness he called home. In the quiet moments of life, sometimes the most profound connections come when we least expect them. Mason's journey reminds us that even in our golden years, we can discover new purpose and healing Like Elizabeth, whose wisdom guided others despite her own losses, we too can find meaning by standing for what matters. Remember when connection seemed simpler, when nature held mystery and wonder. This story speaks to that part of us that yearns for something deeper than our technological world offers, a reminder that wisdom often means knowing when to protect rather than possess, when to witness rather than control. Mason found family again through unexpected circumstances, rebuilding his relationship with Emma not through grand gestures, but through shared purpose and quiet moments on that porch. Isn't that the essence of our own journeys? Finding our way back to what matters most? Have you experienced an unexpected connection that changed your perspective on life? Or perhaps like Mason, have you discovered that protecting something wild and beautiful sometimes means letting it remain free rather than trying to understand it completely? Share your stories of unexpected wisdom in the comments below. We learn most richly from each other's journeys.